She told him, straight to his face, without hesitation, that the new regional director was going to be another useless suit who'd never done a real day of work in his life. The man listened quietly, toolbox at his feet, grease on his knuckles. Not a flicker of reaction. She had no idea she was talking to him, and he had no intention of telling her. If you want to know what happened when she finally found out the truth, stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The elevator shuddered once before it died. Not dramatically. No sparks, no grinding metal, no Hollywood-style lurch that threw people off their feet. It just stopped. A quiet mechanical surrender somewhere between the 4th and 5th floors of the Meridian Pacific building on a Friday evening in late October when the Seattle rain had already been falling for 6 hours straight and showed absolutely no interest in stopping. Claire Dawson felt it in her stomach first. That hollow, weightless second where the floor seemed to drop a half-inch beneath her heels before the emergency brake caught, and everything went still. The fluorescent lights flickered twice, dimmed to something closer to a sickly yellow, and stayed there. She looked up at the ceiling panel like most people do when elevators malfunction, as though the answer might be written up there somewhere. It wasn't. Perfect, she said, to no one in particular. Absolutely perfect. She pressed the door open button. Nothing. She pressed the button for the lobby. Nothing. She pressed the emergency call button and listened to it ring twice before a recorded voice informed her that her call was important and that someone would be with her shortly. She stared at the speaker panel for a long moment. Shortly, she repeated. Sure. She hadn't even noticed the other person in the elevator until he shifted his weight and the metal toolbox in his hand knocked lightly against the wall. Claire startled, actually flinched, which embarrassed her immediately, and turned to find a man standing in the back left corner. He looked to be in his early 30s. Dark hair, not especially long, but not recently cut either. Work pants, a gray thermal shirt with the sleeves pushed up to the elbows. The toolbox was olive green, the kind with a top tray and a lower compartment, and it looked like it had been through several years of actual use, rather than sitting in a garage looking tidy. He raised one hand, a small, non-threatening gesture. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't take up more space than it needed. I didn't see you, Claire said, which was obviously true but felt stupid to say. I got on at 4. You were looking at your phone. She had been looking at her phone. She'd been looking at her phone for the entire ride up, because the email she'd gotten at 4:47 p.m., 13 minutes before end of day on a Friday, because the universe had a specific sense of humor, had informed all Meridian Pacific Northwest Division employees that the new regional director would be arriving Monday morning for what was described as a comprehensive operational assessment, which was corporate language for someone is about to decide which of you still has a job. Claire had been with Meridian Pacific for 3 years. She was a mid-level designer in the brand and interiors division, which handled visual identity and space concepts for the hotel properties Meridian developed and managed across the Pacific Northwest. She was good at her job. She knew she was good at her job. The problem was that being good at your job and surviving a comprehensive operational assessment by a newly appointed regional director from corporate headquarters were two entirely different skill sets, and she had significantly less practice with the second one. She pressed the emergency call button again. Same recorded message. The maintenance worker set his toolbox on the floor and crouched down to open it. He didn't seem particularly alarmed by the situation, which Claire found both reassuring and slightly irritating. You do this a lot? She asked. He glanced up. Get stuck in elevators? Fix them. Often enough. He pulled out a slim flashlight and clicked it on, pointing it toward the control panel seam. Building maintenance for 3 years. This one's done this before. There's a relay issue in the secondary control board. They've been putting off the replacement. Of course they have. Claire leaned against the opposite wall and let out a long breath. Because spending money on things that actually work would cut into someone's bonus. The man didn't respond to that. He moved to the control panel, found the service access latch, and opened it with the kind of efficiency that suggested he wasn't doing it for the first time. Claire watched him for a moment, then looked at her phone. No signal. Of course there was no signal. She had 30% battery and no signal in a broken elevator on a Friday evening while it rained outside, and somewhere across the city, a new regional director was probably reviewing personnel files and drawing little red circles around people he planned to eliminate. "Do you know anything about the new director?" she asked. She wasn't sure why she was talking. Nervous energy, probably. The elevator was maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, and silence in a broken elevator with a stranger felt worse than filling it with something. The man paused very briefly in what he was doing, then continued. "What new director?" "Regional. Meridian Pacific. He starts Monday. Apparently they sent out an email while most of us were still pretending to work." She crossed her arms. "Dylan Mercer. 32 years old, which means he probably has an MBA from somewhere expensive and has never once actually had to worry about whether his position was getting cut." The maintenance worker said nothing. He was examining something inside the control panel with his flashlight. "You know what the rumor is?" Claire continued. "That he was brought in specifically to slim down the regional operations, which means layoffs, which means I should probably be updating my resume right now, except that I'm trapped in a box between the 4th and 5th floors, so." "Rumor from where?" "Karen in accounting, who got it from James in property management, who apparently has a contact at the Chicago office where Mercer came from." She paused. "Which is probably 3 levels of telephone game away from the truth, but still." "Still," he agreed mildly. She stopped herself, then continued anyway, because she was already in it. "I've worked at that office for 3 years. I've watched 2 rounds of layoffs. You know what they have in common? Both times, the person who came in to do the cutting had never spent a single day working at the level where the cuts actually land. They look at numbers on a spreadsheet and they see inefficiencies. They don't see the person who's been working 60-hour weeks on the Harrington Hotel renovation because they actually care about getting it right." She realized she was talking faster than she intended to. She made herself slow down. "Sorry," she said. "You probably don't care about any of this." "I don't mind," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not politely, not performatively, but genuinely, that made her believe him. "It's just frustrating," she said more quietly. "These guys come in from corporate, and they've got their assessment frameworks and their efficiency metrics and their vision statements, and they walk around for 2 weeks pretending to listen, and then they've already decided what they're going to do before they walk through the door. And the people who actually built something, who stayed late and solved problems and actually gave a damn, they're just line items." The maintenance worker sat back on his heels and looked at her, not blankly, not dismissively. There was something thoughtful in the look, something that made her feel oddly like she was actually being heard. "You think that's what this one's going to do?" he asked. "I think that's what they all do," she said. Dylan Mercer, 32, probably never fixed anything in his life that couldn't be fixed by throwing money at it. She caught herself. "No offense," she added, then realized that made no sense given who she was talking to. He seemed to notice the awkwardness and let it go. "None taken." He turned back to the control panel. Claire watched his hands, the way he worked with genuine focus, not performing for an audience, not making a show of what he was doing. He'd already identified the problem and was working toward a solution with a kind of quiet competence that she, in her current mood of profound career anxiety, found unexpectedly soothing. "How long?" she asked. 10 minutes. Maybe less." She nodded and leaned back against the wall. The rain drummed faintly against the building's exterior. Seattle in October had a specific sound, low and persistent, the kind of rain that didn't announce itself dramatically, but simply existed as a fact of the world, like gravity or traffic. "You been with the building long?" she asked. "Not too long." "You like it?" He considered the question more seriously than she expected. "I like working with my hands," he said. "There's something honest about it. Something breaks, you find the problem, you fix it. It either works or it doesn't. No ambiguity." Claire thought about the Harrington project she'd been working on for 8 months, the visual concept they'd developed for the boutique hotel renovation on the waterfront, the way the interior palette had evolved through 17 revisions because the client kept changing the brief, the way the final presentation had gone better than she'd dared hope. She thought about how it felt to walk into a finished space and recognize something you'd put into it, something that existed in the world now because you'd made decisions that mattered. I get that, she said. I'm a designer, interior branding, mostly. There's a version of that in design, when you're actually making something instead of just talking about making something. What's the difference? Meetings, she said flatly, and he made a sound that might have been a laugh. Brief, genuine, quickly contained. What do you like about it? He asked. The design part. The question caught her slightly off guard, not because it was complicated, but because people rarely asked. Usually when she told people she worked in design, they either changed the subject or asked what software she used. The spaces, she said after a moment. The way a room can make you feel something before you've consciously processed what it looks like. The way light hits a surface and shifts the entire emotional register of a space. The way, I know this sounds pretentious, it doesn't. The way you can walk into a hotel lobby and immediately understand what kind of experience you're going to have, and most of that understanding happens before you've read a single sign or spoken to a single person. It's all communicated visually and spatially, and you don't even know it's happening, she paused, which is either beautiful or slightly manipulative, depending on your perspective. Probably both, he said. Yeah, she agreed, probably both. There was a silence that was surprisingly not uncomfortable. He worked. She listened to the rain. The elevator groaned faintly, a pressure equalization somewhere in the shaft, and then went quiet again. What do you think actually makes a good leader? He asked. The question came out of nowhere and nowhere at the same time, connected to the thread of the earlier conversation in a way that felt natural rather than forced. Claire blinked. Are you asking me that seriously? Yeah. She thought about it. Not the performance review answer, not the thing you'd say in a job interview, the actual answer. Someone who understands what the work actually costs, she said slowly. Not financially. I mean, the cost in terms of energy, attention, the thing you give up when you choose to do something with real care. Someone who's been tired at the end of a day because they actually built something that day, not because they sat in meetings arguing about building it. She looked at the floor. Someone who doesn't forget that the people doing the work are people. The maintenance worker turned to look at her fully for the first time since he'd started on the panel. His expression was composed, but something in it had shifted. That's a good answer, he said. It's easy to have good answers when it doesn't cost you anything to say them, she said, standing in a broken elevator. Still, she looked at him. There was something about the way he engaged with what she was saying that was different from what she expected. He wasn't being polite. He wasn't filling silence. He was actually, she searched for the right word, listening. Not in the performative way of someone waiting for their turn to talk, but in the way of someone for whom the information actually meant something. She wondered, briefly, what his story was. People who worked maintenance in mid-sized commercial buildings in Seattle were not typically 30-something men who asked thoughtful questions about leadership philosophy. But people were rarely exactly what they appeared to be at first glance, and she was aware that she was making assumptions she had no real basis for. She was also aware, with some private discomfort, that she'd just spent the last several minutes making very confident pronouncements about a man she'd never met. I probably shouldn't have said all that, she said. About the director. Why not? Because I don't know him. I'm just anxious. And when I'm anxious, I talk. She pressed her lips together. Or I judge people based on what I've heard secondhand from accounting. The corner of his mouth moved. You were honest. I was speculative and probably unfair. Those aren't mutually exclusive, he said. And somehow, impossibly, that made her feel slightly better. He made a final adjustment inside the panel, replaced the cover, and stood. He pressed the lobby button. The elevator hummed. The lights returned to full brightness. The car began to descend. That's it, Claire said. That's it. They need to replace the relay board before it happens again. But for tonight, he picked up his toolbox. It'll hold. Thank you. She meant it straightforwardly without performance. Genuinely. I was starting to calculate how long my phone battery would last and what the odds were that anyone would notice I was missing before Monday. Someone would have noticed. You sound very confident about that. Building security does a sweep at 7, he said. You would have been fine. Good to know. The elevator reached the lobby and the doors opened. The lobby was mostly empty, a security guard at the desk, a janitor running a buffer across the marble floor in slow overlapping arcs. The rain was visible through the glass front of the building, steady and gray. Claire stepped out and turned back. The maintenance worker remained in the elevator, toolbox in hand, presumably heading up to wherever he'd been going before the malfunction made that impossible. Have a good weekend, she said. You too. He looked at her directly. And Claire. She paused. She hadn't told him her name, but there was a lanyard around her neck with her ID badge on it, she realized. Her name was right there on the badge. Of course he'd read it. People read badges. Yeah? The things you said about what makes a good leader. A pause. They were worth saying. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she just nodded and said, "Thank you, really, for fixing it." He nodded once. The doors closed. Claire stood in the lobby for a moment, listening to the rain and the buffer machine and the distant sound of the security guard's radio. She felt oddly unsettled in a way she couldn't specifically locate. Not unpleasantly, just the feeling of a conversation that had moved in directions she hadn't expected and left her slightly off-center. She told herself it was just the anxiety about Monday. She pulled her coat tighter, pushed through the glass doors into the rain, and walked toward the parking garage, already composing in her head the text she was going to send her best friend Maya about what a disaster this week had been and how she had absolutely no idea what Monday was going to bring. She had no idea. That was the truest thing she'd thought all evening. The weekend passed the way anxious weekends tend to pass. Too quickly in the parts where she was distracted and too slowly in the parts where she was left alone with her own thoughts. She cleaned her apartment on Saturday, which she only did when she was stressed, and by Sunday afternoon the place was exceptionally tidy, in a way that made her feel productive and terrified in equal measure. Maya came over Sunday evening with Thai food and a bottle of cheap wine and the specific kind of friendship that involved saying things like, "You're probably overthinking it," and, "But what if you're not and we should have a backup plan?" "What do you actually know about him?" Maya asked, cross-legged on the couch, chopsticks in hand. "Mercer? Barely anything. I looked him up online, but his professional profile is basically nothing. No social media I could find. LinkedIn has a photo and a job history, but it's pretty minimal." "How does he look in the photo?" "Maya. I'm just asking. First impressions." Claire sighed. "He looks like every other corporate guy who shows up in a professional headshot. Suit, neutral expression, hair that has been recently and expensively cut. So we hate him." "We don't hate him. We are professionally concerned about his objectives." "That's just hating him with better vocabulary." Maya refilled her wine glass. "What's your actual plan for Monday?" "Go in, do my job, be competent, not say anything stupid." She paused. "The last one's the hardest." "You can do it." "I once told a client that their vision board looked like it had been made by someone who'd only ever seen the inside of an airport hotel." "To their face?" "In a meeting." Maya was quiet for a second. "Were you right?" "Completely. But that's beside the point. Okay, so go in, be competent, and keep the airport hotel observation to yourself unless explicitly invited to share it." "That's the plan." Claire reached for her wine glass. Outside the apartment window, Seattle continued its ongoing commitment to rain. She thought briefly, and for no reason she could explain, about the maintenance worker in the elevator, about the way he'd listened, about the way he'd said the things you said were worth saying. She wondered if he'd gotten the relay board fixed. She put it out of her mind. Monday arrived with the particular cruelty of Mondays that follow anxious weekends, which is to say it arrived exactly when it said it would and offered no additional buffer time for emotional preparation. Claire got to the office at 8:15, which was earlier than usual. The Meridian Pacific Northwest Regional Office occupied floors 4 through 6 of the Meridian Pacific building, the same building with the same unreliable elevator. And by the time she reached the 4th floor design suite, half a dozen of her colleagues were already there, doing the thing that stressed office workers do, which is pretend to work while actually watching the door. "He's not here yet," said Ben Kowalski from the desk across from hers. Ben was a project coordinator who had been with the company longer than anyone in the design suite and had survived 2 previous rounds of layoffs by being, in his own words, genuinely useful and kind of invisible. He had the calm of someone who'd already processed the anxiety and come out the other side. "Parking situation, apparently. I heard from Diane in facilities that he drove himself." "Drove himself?" said Priya Okafor from the next desk over. She was a junior designer who'd joined the team 8 months ago and had not yet experienced a corporate restructuring and therefore still had the energy for genuine alarm. "Why would he drive himself? Doesn't he have, a driver?" "Maybe he likes driving," Claire said. "People who have drivers don't like driving," Priya said with the certainty of someone who had never had a driver. "That's the whole point. You don't know that. I'm choosing to know that." The morning passed in a low-level haze of pretend productivity. Emails were opened and closed without being fully read. Coffee was consumed in quantities that were probably not medically advisable. At 9:30, a message from HR went out confirming that Director Mercer would be conducting brief one-on-one introductory meetings with all division leads throughout the week, beginning Tuesday, and that today he would be doing a walkthrough of the facilities. "A walkthrough," Ben said. "Of the facilities," Priya added. "With us in them," Claire said. "Like a zoo," Ben said. "That's not helpful," Claire said. "It's a little helpful," Priya said. At 10:15, Claire needed to go to the supply room on the 5th floor to retrieve a set of printed presentation boards she'd submitted for laminating the week before. She took the elevator, the repaired elevator, and stepped out onto 5 to find the floor in a state of quiet activity, the various project management and operations teams doing exactly what the design team downstairs was doing, which was pretending to work while listening for footsteps. She retrieved her boards from the facilities room at the end of the hall. On her way back, passing the bank of glass-walled conference rooms that lined the eastern side of the building, she glanced through the glass and stopped. The man standing inside conference room 5B had his back to the glass, looking at a whiteboard where someone had written the words Northwest Division, Operational Overview in blue marker. He was talking to 2 women from the executive assistant pool, both of whom were nodding and taking notes. He was wearing a suit today, charcoal gray, well-fitted, not flashy, and his posture was easy, not rigid or performative. She recognized the posture before she recognized anything else, before she registered the charcoal suit, or the fact that both executive assistants were acting the way people act around someone with authority. She recognized the posture because she'd watched it while it crouched over a broken elevator control panel with a flashlight. The man in conference room 5B turned slightly, enough for her to see his profile, and Claire Dawson felt the floor do something very similar to what it had done when the elevator stopped. It was him, the maintenance worker, the man she'd spent 20 minutes talking to in a broken elevator on Friday evening, the man to whom she had said, among other things, that Dylan Mercer was probably a guy who'd never fixed anything in his life that couldn't be fixed by throwing money at it, was Dylan Mercer. She stood in the hallway with her presentation boards clutched against her chest, and her brain doing something she could only describe as a full restart. A complete system shutdown and reboot, the kind that takes longer than you'd like and leaves everything feeling slightly misaligned when it comes back online. He hadn't told her. She'd talked for 20 minutes. She'd said his name out loud. She'd described him as a man who'd never done a real day of work. She'd given an impassioned speech about the failures of corporate leadership. And he had sat there with his toolbox and his flashlight and listened to every word of it and not said a single thing. His head turned. He looked directly at her through the glass. There was a moment, one of those moments that felt significantly longer than it actually was, where their eyes met and Claire understood, from the lack of surprise in his expression, that he had already seen her, that he had in fact recognized her the moment she walked past. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look entertained exactly, but there was something in his expression that she couldn't fully read and that did absolutely nothing to help with the full system reboot situation her brain was currently working through. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Professional, neutral. The nod of a regional director acknowledging a passing employee through the glass wall of a conference room. Claire Dawson nodded back. Then she walked, with what she could only hope was a normal human gait, to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. She got in. She rode back to the fourth floor in complete silence, staring at her own reflection in the elevator's polished metal doors, holding presentation boards she no longer remembered retrieving. "You okay?" Priya asked when she walked back to her desk. "Completely fine," Claire said. She set the boards down and sat and stared at her monitor for a long moment. Dylan Mercer. He'd been in that elevator on a Friday evening, after hours, carrying a toolbox in work clothes with grease on his knuckles, not doing a meet and greet, not introducing himself, not positioning himself as the approachable executive, just there, working, fixing something that needed to be fixed, and he had listened to her describe him as someone who'd never fixed anything in his life. She reached for her coffee. Her hand was not entirely steady. The worst part, the genuinely worst part, she realized, sitting at her desk with her heart doing something irregular, was that he hadn't been angry. He hadn't corrected her. He hadn't said anything cutting or defensive. He had listened and asked questions and engaged with what she was saying, like a person who was genuinely interested in what she thought, like a person who didn't need to win the conversation, like a person who was, against every expectation she'd walked into that elevator with, exactly the kind of leader she'd just described. She opened her email. She closed her email. She opened a design file. She closed the design file. On the floor above her, the new regional director continued his first-day walkthrough. She could occasionally hear footsteps through the ceiling. Claire looked at the presentation board she'd just retrieved. The Harrington Project, 8 months of work, 17 revisions. The best thing she'd done since joining this company. She straightened her spine. She opened the design file again. Whatever happened next, she had done her job well. She was going to keep doing her job well. That was the one thing she could actually control, and she was going to hold on to it with both hands. The footsteps overhead moved slowly, deliberately, toward the far end of the building. She put her headphones in and got back to work. The one-on-one meetings started Tuesday, as promised. HR sent out a scheduling matrix Monday afternoon. Each division lead would have 30 minutes with Director Mercer, beginning with operations at 9, then property management, then finance, then design at 2:30. Claire read the email 3 times. She wasn't a division lead. She was mid-level, which meant she probably wasn't on the list, which meant she had an extra day or two to figure out how to be a normal professional human being in the presence of a man she'd spent 20 minutes insulting in a broken elevator. She told herself this was a reasonable amount of time to get her composure together. She was wrong. She got called in Wednesday at 11:15, not as part of the official schedule, but as what the email from his assistant described as an informal drop-in to connect with additional team members. The email arrived at 11, and the meeting was at 11:15, which gave her exactly enough time to close 4 browser tabs she didn't want him to theoretically see through some impossible mechanism, refill her coffee, and spend 40 seconds in the bathroom mirror talking herself down from what she privately categorized as a minor situational anxiety spiral. "You're fine," she told her reflection. "You work here. You're good at your job. The thing in the elevator was a misunderstanding, and adults move past misunderstandings." Her reflection looked unconvinced, but didn't offer an alternative strategy. She knocked on the conference room door at 11:14. He was already there, standing at the window with a coffee cup that looked like it was from the cart downstairs rather than the executive suite's single-serve machine, looking out at the gray Seattle sky with the expression of someone who was thinking about something specific rather than just waiting. "Claire," he said, and turned. Not Ms. Dawson, just Claire, casual and without weight, as though the ease of it were completely unremarkable. "Director Mercer," she said. Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Dylan is fine." She sat down across from him at the conference table and put her hands flat on the surface in front of her, which she immediately recognized as something she did when she was trying not to fidget, and then moved her hands to her lap, because having them flat on the table looked slightly like she was preparing to be fingerprinted. He sat across from her. He had a legal pad in front of him with handwritten notes on it, actual handwriting, in blue pen, in a script that was small and slightly irregular, the kind that belongs to someone who writes quickly and for themselves rather than for an audience. "How long have you been with the design team?" he asked. 3 years. I came from a small firm in Portland, residential mostly, some commercial. Meridian was the first corporate position. Do you like it better or worse? She hesitated. The honest answer and the safe answer were not the same answer. Different, she said. In a smaller firm, you have more control over individual projects, but less resources and less scale. Here, the projects are larger, which means the impact is larger, but... She stopped. But? There's more distance between the decision and the thing that gets built, she said carefully. Sometimes the best version of a project gets negotiated away before it ever gets close to reality. He wrote something on the legal pad. She tried not to look at what it was. Which projects have you worked on since joining? She walked him through her portfolio. The 3 hotel renovations she'd contributed to, the 2 she'd led significant portions of, the Harrington project currently in its final phase. She talked about the Harrington the way she always talked about it when she let herself be honest about it, which was with the slightly compressed energy of someone trying not to sound like they care too much while clearly caring very much. The interior palette went through a lot of iterations, she said. The client kept shifting the brief. We were trying to build something that felt genuinely connected to the waterfront location without doing the obvious nautical thing that every waterfront hotel has done for 30 years. It took a while to find the right language for it. What's the right language? Industrial warmth, she said. The building used to be a processing warehouse. We leaned into that, the bones of the space, the way light comes through the high windows in the afternoon, but softened it with materials and colors that don't feel cold or utilitarian. It's supposed to feel like you're somewhere that used to make something, and now makes you comfortable instead. Dylan looked at her for a moment without writing anything. Can I see it? The project? The presentations, the concept boards, whatever you have. Yeah, of course. She paused. The final boards are actually the ones I picked up from laminating on Monday. If you want, I can bring them by this afternoon if you have time, he said. No rush. She left the meeting at 11:43 with a sensation she couldn't entirely identify. Not relief, because relief required the removal of a threat, and she wasn't sure the threat had been fully removed. More like the cognitive dissonance of expecting one thing and receiving another. He hadn't mentioned the elevator. He had treated the meeting with the clean professionalism of 2 people who were simply getting acquainted with each other's work. There was no edge to it, no subtext she could detect, no moment where he'd deployed the knowledge of what she'd said to position himself advantageously. She thought about that all the way back to her desk. Ben looked up from his monitor. How was it? Fine, she said. Fine like genuinely fine, or fine like I need you to not ask me follow-up questions? Fine like I genuinely don't know yet, she said, and sat down and pulled up the Harrington files. She brought him the boards at 2. He was between meetings, standing in the hallway outside his office with a tablet in one hand and what appeared to be a slightly malfunctioning cart from the copy room. One of the wheels had seized up, and it was leaning at an angle that was going to deposit its entire cargo of paper reams onto the floor. He was examining the wheel with the same focused, non-alarmed expression she recognized from the elevator, and when she rounded the corner with the boards under her arm, he looked up. Hold on, he said to her, rather than to the cart, and then spent about 45 seconds doing something to the wheel with what turned out to be a small multi-tool from his jacket pocket. Who carries a multi-tool in their suit jacket, Claire thought, until the cart sat level again. You could have called facilities, she said. I was already here. He folded the multi-tool and slid it back into his pocket. The boards. She handed them over. He looked through them in the hallway, unhurried, with the kind of attention that suggested he was actually looking rather than performing the act of looking. He asked 2 questions. One about the material specifications for the lobby floor, and one about the lighting strategy for the guest corridor, that were specific enough to tell her he understood what he was looking at. This is good, he said. Not this is great, not this is exceptional, not the superlative heavy language of corporate praise that meant everything and nothing, just this is good, delivered with the same plainness as everything else he said, which somehow made it land harder. Thank you, she said. He handed the boards back. You should present this at the division review. Full presentation, not just the boards. Can you put something together by Thursday? She blinked. The division review, this Thursday. Is that not enough time? It's, she recalculated. It's enough time. Yes. Good. He picked up his tablet from where he'd set it on the now functional cart. I'll let you get back to it. She watched him walk down the hallway toward the next meeting on his schedule, and then stood there for a second holding her presentation boards and thinking about how nothing about this week was tracking against any of the predictions she'd made while standing in a broken elevator on Friday. She went back downstairs and started working on the Thursday presentation. The week moved in a way she hadn't expected. Part of what made it strange was that Dylan Mercer's presence in the office was not what any of them had anticipated, not what Claire had anticipated specifically, and she was willing to admit, at least privately, that her anticipations had been particularly loud and specific. He arrived before most people and left, as far as she could tell, after most people. He attended meetings but didn't dominate them in the way that executives sometimes do when they want the room to understand who's in charge. He asked more questions than he gave directives. He remembered the names of people he'd met in passing and used them correctly in subsequent interactions, which sounds like a small thing but is actually the kind of thing that registers subliminally as a signal of attention. On Wednesday afternoon, she walked past the server room, a small, overly warm room on the 5th floor that housed the building's network equipment, and heard two voices inside. One was Marcus from IT, who was the kind of person who responded to network outages with the specific energy of someone who has been having the same argument with the same malfunctioning equipment for years. The other voice she recognized before she'd consciously processed why she recognized it. She stopped in the hallway. Firmware update should have fixed the latency issue, but it didn't, which means it's a hardware problem, which means we need to replace the routing unit, which has been on the capital request list for 2 years, Marcus was saying, with the weary precision of someone reciting evidence in a case they've already proven and simply have not yet won. Who denied the capital request? Dylan asked. Regional Finance, both times. Send me the request documentation, both versions. I'll look at it today. A pause. Today? Before 5. Another pause, shorter this time. Okay, Marcus said, in the tone of someone who has learned not to trust certain kinds of promises, but is cautiously open to being wrong. Claire moved on before either of them came out of the server room. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. About the fact that he had been in the server room, not because someone had flagged a network emergency, but because, she reconstructed the timeline, he had been doing his walkthrough of facilities and had apparently wandered into a conversation with Marcus and stayed in it until he understood what the actual problem was. She thought about what she'd said in the elevator, about executives with assessment frameworks and efficiency metrics, about decisions made before anyone walked through the door. She presented the Harrington project Thursday afternoon to a conference room that included Dylan, both division directors, a representative from the finance team, and 3 of her colleagues from design who had variously worked on or adjacent to the project. She had put the presentation together in less than 48 hours, which was not ideal, but she knew the project well enough that the time pressure had forced clarity, rather than creating gaps. She stood at the front of the room with the boards lined up along the wall behind her, and talked about the project the way she'd talked about it in that conference room with Dylan on Wednesday, with honest enthusiasm rather than polished corporate presentation voice, because she'd decided at some point between Wednesday and Thursday that if this was the moment it was all going to fall apart, she was at least going to fall apart telling the truth. She talked about the warehouse bones and the industrial warmth and the afternoon light through the high windows. She talked about the 17 revisions and what each one had taught them about what the space was trying to be. She talked about the moment, about 6 months in, revision 12, 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, when she'd looked at a material sample under a specific lamp and understood how to reconcile the two things the client was asking for that had seemed mutually exclusive. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment in a way that could have been bad or good. What's the timeline to completion? The finance representative asked. 6 weeks to soft opening if the final contractor walkthrough happens on schedule, which, she glanced at her notes, is in 3 weeks. Budget position? Under by 4% currently. The contractor substituted a lower-cost ceiling tile in the back corridors without flagging it, and we caught it in the last site visit, so there may be a remediation cost. Dylan, who had been quiet through most of the presentation, spoke for the first time since her opening. What's the remediation cost estimate? Roughly $8,000. Is there contingency for it? $12,000 in contingency remaining. He nodded. So it's manageable. If nothing else comes up, what are the likely candidates for something else coming up? She liked that question. She liked that he asked about the risk in specific terms rather than just accepting the optimistic answer. She walked him through the remaining variables: the custom millwork for the bar that was still in fabrication, the lighting fixtures on back order, the question of whether the client's last-minute request to add a communal workspace to the lobby mezzanine was going to require a structural consult. He listened to all of it, asked 2 more questions that were both good, and then said, "Nice work," in the same plain way he'd said, "This is good about the boards," and the meeting moved on to the next agenda item. She gathered her materials afterward and was almost to the door when he said, without looking up from whatever he was writing on his legal pad, "The lighting strategy for the guest corridor. You mentioned the back order." She turned. The rest of the room had mostly filed out. "Yeah, 6 weeks out currently. It's the one thing that could push the soft opening. Is there an alternative source?" "I've been looking. There's a supplier in Portland who makes something similar. Not identical, but close. The lead time is 10 days. Have you spec'd it against the original?" "I have a draft comparison. I haven't sent it up because the original might still arrive in time, and I didn't want to create noise around a problem that might not materialize." He looked up from the legal pad. "Send me the comparison. If we need to switch, better to make that decision now than in 4 weeks." "Okay. And it's a good instinct," he added, "not creating noise. But this one's close enough to the deadline that I'd rather know." She nodded and left the conference room and stood in the hallway for a second longer than necessary. It was a small thing. It was a completely ordinary project management conversation. But there was something in the way he engaged with the specifics, with the actual materials and lead times and contingency math, not with the 30,000-foot version, that she kept finding unexpectedly disarming. She sent him the lighting comparison document at 4:15. He responded at 4:40 with 2 specific questions about the specifications and a note that said the Portland supplier looked viable if they needed it. She responded, he responded, and by 5 they had a contingency plan that hadn't existed that morning. She turned off her monitor and sat for a moment in the emptying office, listening to the building settle and the rain do its ongoing Seattle thing outside the windows. She was trying to think about Dylan Mercer as a professional reality rather than as a problem to be managed, and she was finding that every time she tried to reduce him to a professional category, something specific got in the way. The multi-tool in the suit pocket, the server room visit, the legal pad with the handwritten notes, the fact that he'd been in a service elevator with a toolbox on a Friday evening, not because he was trying to make a point about being a hands-on leader, but apparently because something needed to be fixed and he was in the building. She gathered her bag and her coat and her presentation boards and took the elevator down to the lobby. The same elevator. It ran smoothly. She thought about the relay board and wondered if it had been replaced yet, or if it was still holding on the temporary fix he'd made Friday night while she talked at him about everything she thought was wrong with people like him. The thing nobody tells you about reassessing a strong first impression is that it doesn't happen cleanly. It doesn't arrive as a revelation. It comes in pieces, at inconvenient moments, and it tends to be annoying rather than cathartic because it requires you to sit with the knowledge that you were wrong in ways you were very confident about. Claire spent the second week in a low-grade state of cognitive renovation. She was dismantling something she'd built carefully, the framework through which she'd understood what kind of person Dylan Mercer was going to be. And the materials didn't come down in an orderly way. They came down in fragments, each one attached to a specific moment. The moment Marcus from IT mentioned, in passing at the coffee cart, that the routing unit replacement had been approved and was being expedited. That was one fragment. The moment she walked past an empty conference room at 7:15 in the morning and saw Dylan in it, alone, on the phone, pacing slowly with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, stopping occasionally to write something on the whiteboard and then erase it. Not the performance of productivity, but the actual version of it, unobserved, and therefore not performed for anyone. That was another fragment. The moment she was in the kitchen refilling her coffee, and he came in and poured himself a cup from the same communal pot that everyone else used and said, "The Harrington contingency. I heard back from Portland. They can hold the allocation for 2 more weeks if we need it." And she said, "The original shipment just got updated to 3 weeks out." And he said, "So we're probably fine." And she said, "Probably, Mick." And he said, "Let me know if that changes." And then topped off his coffee and left. And the entire exchange took 45 seconds and contained nothing remarkable except for the fact that the regional director of a multi-billion-dollar real estate company was tracking the lead time on light fixtures for a hotel renovation because he'd been in a specific meeting and asked a specific question and followed it. That was a lot of fragments. Priya noticed something had shifted in Claire's general demeanor around the end of the second week, in the way that people who share a workspace notice things without necessarily intending to. "You seem less terrified," Priya said on Friday afternoon. "I was never terrified." Claire: "I was professionally concerned." "You color-coded your contingency documents," Priya said. "You don't color-code unless you're in a specific emotional state." "Color-coding is efficient? Color-coding is how you cope." Priya tilted her head. "What changed?" Claire thought about it. The honest answer was complicated in ways she wasn't ready to fully examine, so she gave the simpler true version. "He's not what I thought he was going to be." "Good, not what you thought, or just different, not what you thought?" "Good," she said after a pause. He actually listens. Like actually listens, not in the way where someone makes eye contact and nods while clearly planning their response." "Okay," Priya said. "And he knows things about the work, not just the business-level version of it, the actual work, the logistics, the materials, the problems that exist at the ground level where people actually have to solve them." "Okay," Priya said again, in a slightly different register. "What?" "Nothing." "You made a face." "I didn't make a face." "Priya." "I said okay. I meant okay." She turned back to her monitor and then turned back. "Is he attractive?" "That's not relevant." "That's not a no." "It's not—" Claire stopped. "It's not relevant," she said again more firmly, and turned back to her own monitor, which was currently displaying the Harrington lighting comparison document that she'd already reviewed twice and didn't need to review again. The problem with Priya's question was not that it was wrong. The problem was that it pointed at something Claire had been carefully not looking at directly, the way you don't look directly at something bright because looking at it makes the shape of it too clear. Dylan Mercer was 32 years old and the widowed single father of a 6-year-old daughter, which she'd learned not from gossip, but from a casual mention he'd made in a team meeting when someone asked about his schedule flexibility, and he'd said, without self-pity or performance, that he tried to keep his evenings clear when possible because his daughter's school pickup was the one thing he didn't renegotiate. He'd said it matter-of-factly, the way you state a structural constraint, and then moved on. And the meeting moved on, but Claire had stayed briefly in the moment of it. A 6-year-old daughter, raising her alone, running a regional division and carrying a multi-tool in his jacket pocket, and apparently spending Friday evenings fixing broken elevator relays, and still making school pickup a non-negotiable. She had a general policy against developing complicated feelings about people she worked for, a policy that had served her reasonably well for 3 years, and that she intended to maintain. She was going to need to maintain it a little more actively going forward, was the thing. The second week ended on a Friday again, same as all weeks do, and Claire was staying late to finish a final revision on the Harrington concept for the client's pre-opening review when she heard footsteps on the floor above her. Slow, deliberate, moving toward what she thought was the north stairwell, then descending. Then, oddly, stopping on her floor. She heard the stairwell door, heard the footsteps in the hallway, and then Dylan appeared in the doorway of the design suite. He stopped when he saw her. "You're still here." Finishing the Harrington concept revision, she looked at the clock. It was 7:20. "You're still here." "I was on 5. Lost track of time." He looked at what she was working on. "The pre-opening review is when?" 2 weeks. He leaned in the doorway. He'd taken his jacket off at some point during the day and hadn't put it back on. She noticed this in the way you notice something you're trying not to pay attention to. cataloged, and then immediately set aside. The mezzanine workspace question, he said. Did the client ever clarify whether they want it? They confirmed yesterday. They do. Which means we need the structural consult after all. Have you? I scheduled it for Monday. She looked at him. I was going to tell you, but you were in back-to-back meetings. Monday works. He paused. The 4% under budget position, has that changed with the mezzanine addition? It will. I'm updating the estimates now, which is why I'm still here. He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone thinking about leaving, but in the way of someone deciding something. Is there anything I can do that would actually help rather than just be in the way? The question was so plainly and specifically phrased that it caught her off guard. What? I'm decent at numbers. If you're updating budget estimates, sometimes a second set of eyes is faster than running it yourself twice. She looked at him. There was nothing in his expression that suggested he was performing generosity or manufacturing an excuse to be somewhere. He just looked like someone who had an hour and was offering to use it usefully. You're the regional director, she said, and right now I'm someone with nothing on my calendar until 8 who knows how to read a budget spreadsheet. He pulled out the chair across from her desk. Unless you'd rather work alone. She looked at her spreadsheet, at the clock, at the stack of material invoices she still needed to cross-reference. No. Okay. The contractor substitution issue and the ceiling tiles. I need to verify the remediation cost against the original spec. If you can cross-reference the original purchase order against the substituted product invoice and tell me if there's a delta I missed, that would actually help. Send me the files. She did. He sat across from her with his legal pad, and they worked for an hour in a silence that was punctuated by occasional specific questions, his to her about project context, hers to him about the numbers, and the rain, which had been doing its thing all day and showed no signs of stopping. At 8:15, they had a clean, updated budget estimate with 3 contingency scenarios, a clear picture of the ceiling tile remediation cost, and a note to the contractor that Claire drafted, and he reviewed without changing anything except one word in the second sentence that she immediately agreed was better. That's actually in good shape, he said, looking at the final spreadsheet. Yeah. She leaned back in her chair. Her back hurt. She'd been sitting in the same position for too long. Thank you. That would have taken me until 9 on my own. It's a good project, he said, for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. And she was starting to understand that when he said something simple like that, he meant it in a way that wasn't simple. He stood and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. She shut down her computer. They rode the elevator down together. The same elevator, which was running smoothly, the relay board still apparently holding or perhaps already replaced, she wasn't sure. And neither of them mentioned the first time they'd been in it together, which was a thing they were both clearly aware of and had, by some mutual unspoken agreement, decided to leave where it was. In the lobby, they walked toward the doors, and the security guard nodded at both of them without making it strange. Outside, the rain had settled into a light, persistent mist. The streetlights made everything look like a photograph taken slightly out of focus. You walking or driving? He asked. Driving. Parking structures across the street. She looked at the mist. You? Driving. He looked in the same direction she was looking, at the gray, wet street. Parking's on 2. Right. She pulled on her coat. Good night. Good night, he said. She crossed the street without looking back. She didn't need to look back to know he was still standing in the entrance for a moment before heading to the parking structure, because she could feel it the way you feel someone's presence even when you're not looking at it. A specific awareness that was neither comfortable nor particularly comfortable to be aware of. She drove home through wet Seattle streets, rain on the windows, the city doing its Friday night thing around her. She called Maya without really deciding to. Tell me I'm being an idiot, she said when Maya picked up. About what specifically? About... She stopped at a red light. Never mind, it doesn't matter. Claire. He's my boss, Maya. Ah, Maya said. He's my boss and I work for him, and he's good at his job and that's it. That's the entire thing. Okay, Maya said. I mean it. I know you mean it. The light changed. Claire drove. The rain came down. He stayed late to help me with budget estimates, she said. Just Volunteered for no reason. No reason, Maya repeated. As a colleague? Professionally? Of course. Stop doing that. I'm not doing anything. You're using your agreeable voice. I only have one voice, Claire. You have at least four. She turned onto her street. Forget I called. I will never forget you called, Maya said warmly. Drive safe. Claire parked in her building's lot and sat in the car for an extra minute, listening to the engine tick and the rain tap the roof in its unhurried way. She thought about what she'd said in the elevator, her first night in this building, about not knowing someone but being very confident about what they were, about the distance between the story you tell yourself and the actual person standing in front of you. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to be a person who made the same mistake twice in the same direction. She was just going to do her job. She was going to finish the Harrington project. She was going to go to work on Monday and be a professional. She got out of the car and went upstairs and made herself dinner and didn't think about it anymore. Mostly. The Harrington soft opening happened on a Thursday evening in late November, and it went well enough that Claire spent most of Friday morning in a quiet, private state of relief that she didn't fully express to anyone because she didn't want to jinx the feeling retroactively. The Portland lighting fixtures had arrived 10 days before the opening. The original order had slipped another week, and they'd made the switch, which turned out to be the right call because the Portland version had a slightly warmer color temperature that worked better against the reclaimed wood paneling than the original spec would have. One of those accidents that looks like a decision in retrospect. The ceiling tile remediation had come in at $6,200, inside contingency. The mezzanine workspace had required a structural consult that added 4 days to the schedule and a modest cost that still kept them under budget overall. The client had walked through the finished lobby at 5 p.m. on opening day and stood in the middle of it for a long moment without saying anything, which was either very good or very bad, and then turned and said, "This is what I was trying to describe for 2 years and couldn't," which was the best possible version of a client response, and the kind that made 17 revisions feel like the correct number rather than the exhausting one. Claire had texted Dylan from the site, just 2 words, "Client happy." His response came 4 minutes later, "Good work." She stood in the finished lobby for a few minutes after the client left for the reception, looking at the light coming through the high windows at the angle she'd spent 8 months trying to preserve in the design. The industrial warmth was real. The space felt like something. It felt like what she'd been trying to make it feel like, and the gap between that and what she'd hoped for was small enough that she decided, standing there, to let herself feel good about it. She felt good about it for most of the next day, and then the Monday after that arrived and brought with it a set of developments that pushed the Harrington project to the back of her attention in a way it would stay for longer than she expected. The email came at 8:50 a.m., before most of the team had finished their first coffee. It was from corporate headquarters, not from the Northwest Regional Office, not from Dylan's account, but directly from the executive operations team in Chicago. It was addressed to all Northwest Division staff and was written in the specific variety of corporate language that had been carefully optimized to communicate very little while generating maximum anxiety. It said that corporate was conducting a review of regional capital expenditures for the previous fiscal year, and that certain budget allocations would be under assessment. It said that a detailed report would be forthcoming. It said that this was a routine process. It was the word routine that made everyone nervous because in the language of corporate communications, routine was what you called something when you specifically didn't want to call it what it was. "This is about the Alcott project," Ben said at 9:15, in the specific low voice he used when he was saying something that didn't need to travel past the immediate cluster of desks. The Alcott project was a boutique hotel development in Tacoma that the Northwest Division had been building for 14 months. It was the largest single project the regional office had undertaken in 5 years, and it had been approved with a budget that, as of the last reporting period Claire was aware of, was running significantly over. "How over?" she asked. "Depends on who you ask," Ben said. "Officially 12%. Unofficially, the number James heard from property management is closer to 22. Priya looked up from her monitor. 22% over on a project that size is a lot, Ben confirmed. "Yeah." "Does Mercer know?" He's the regional director, Claire said. Of course he knows. But she wasn't actually certain of that, and the uncertainty sat uneasily for the rest of the morning. Dylan had been with the Northwest office for 6 weeks. The Alcott project had been running for 14 months. Whatever decisions had been made about that budget, whatever had caused it to go as far over as it apparently had, those decisions predated him by more than a year. She ran into him at the 11th floor coffee station at 10:30, which was the small kitchen area adjacent to the executive suite that technically anyone could use, but that most people treated as executive adjacent space and avoided unless they had a specific reason to be there. Claire had a specific reason. The communal machine on 4 was broken and she needed coffee. And Dylan was already there, standing at the counter with a cup in his hand, looking out the window at the gray November sky with the expression she'd come to recognize as him, processing something he hadn't finished processing yet. He turned when she came in. Whatever he'd been thinking about, he put it somewhere. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She moved to the machine. "Have you seen the email from Chicago?" A pause that was a fraction of a second longer than neutral. "I've seen it." She looked at him. He looked back at her in a way that didn't close the conversation but didn't open it either. The expression of someone who has more information than they're currently distributing and has reasons for that aren't about deception. "Is it the Alcott project?" she asked. "The review is broad," he said. "It covers multiple line items." Which was not a no. "Ben is saying 22% over." "Ben is getting his numbers from James, who got them from someone in property management who has access to partial data," Dylan said evenly. "The full picture is more complicated than a single percentage." "More complicated how?" He looked at her for a moment. She got the feeling he was deciding something about how much to say, not for political reasons, but for reasons of accuracy, not wanting to characterize a situation with incomplete information any more than he already had to. There were scope changes approved at the corporate level 18 months ago that weren't fully reflected in the regional budget allocations, he said, which means the cost increase is real, but the attribution is more complicated than it looks on the surface. Claire let that settle. So someone approved a scope change that cost money and didn't adjust the budget accordingly. Something like that. Who approved the scope change? He picked up his coffee cup. That's what the review is trying to establish. She made her coffee and left him to the window and the gray sky. She went back to her desk and sat down and thought about what he'd said. Scope changes approved at the corporate level. Budgets not adjusted. The kind of thing that looks, in a review, like regional mismanagement, like someone on the ground failed to control costs, when the actual cause was decisions made above the regional level that hadn't been properly documented in the regional budget. The kind of thing that was very easy to misread if you were looking at a spreadsheet from Chicago and didn't have the full context. She thought about Dylan's expression at the coffee station, the way he'd put whatever he was thinking somewhere when she walked in. She thought about the fact that he was the regional director of record, that when corporate looked at the Alcott numbers, the regional director's name was attached to them, regardless of when he'd arrived and what decisions had actually been made by whom. That thought stayed with her the rest of the week and into the next. The review documentation request came the following Wednesday. Every division head and project lead received a request for specific records, approvals, change orders, correspondence, related to the Alcott project and several others. Claire's involvement with Alcott had been minimal. She'd consulted on the interior brand concept in the early stages, before the scope changes had apparently occurred, but she pulled what she had and submitted it to the review coordinator as requested. In the process of pulling those files, she found something. She almost missed it. It was buried in an email chain from 16 months ago, before Dylan, before the current finance director, back when the division had been run by an interim director whose name she vaguely recognized and who had left the company abruptly 9 months ago for reasons that had never been fully explained to anyone below the executive level. The email chain was between the interim director and someone at the Chicago corporate office named Richard Hollis, whose title was Senior Vice President of Capital Allocation. It was marked internal and contained about 12 messages in, an exchange that was brief and oddly specific. The interim director had written, confirming that the Alcott scope amendment per our call is approved at this level and will be reflected in the next capital review cycle. Richard Hollis had written back, confirmed. Proceed as discussed. Note that the Q4 capital review will not capture this cycle, carry forward to Q1 of next fiscal, which meant the scope change, the one that added cost, had been approved between the interim director and a senior corporate executive, with the explicit understanding that it would not be reflected in the budget until the following fiscal year. And then, apparently, it hadn't been reflected in the Q1 budget either, or the Q2 budget, or the Q3 budget, which meant there was documented evidence sitting in a filing system that the cost increase had been authorized at a level above the regional office and then never properly accounted for, and that evidence predated Dylan Mercer's arrival by over a year. Claire sat in front of her monitor for a long time. She was not in corporate legal. She was not in finance. She was a mid-level designer who had been asked to submit records related to her minimal involvement with the Alcott project, and she had found, in the course of doing that, something that was very probably not her problem to deal with, except that she knew what she knew. And she knew what the email said. And she knew that without that email, the current review was going to land on Dylan's desk in a way that was catastrophically unfair to him, because whoever was conducting the review from Chicago was almost certainly looking at cost overruns on a regional director's watch, without the context that explained where those cost overruns had actually originated. She did not make the decision that afternoon. She made it the next morning after a night of bad sleep and a conversation with Maya that went, "You found evidence that clears him. I found an email chain that provides context that materially changes the picture of what happened. Claire. It also implicates a senior corporate executive in what looks like a deliberate decision to defer budget documentation in a way that created, Claire, a really significant problem for whoever was holding the regional bag when the review finally happened. You found evidence that clears him," Maya said again. A long pause. "Yes. And you're not sure whether to submit it." "I'm sure I should submit it. I'm not sure what happens after I submit it. Because if Richard Hollis is a senior vice president of capital allocation in Chicago, and I'm submitting documentation that implies he participated in what looks, at a generous reading, like very sloppy financial governance, and at an ungenerous reading," another pause. Deliberate misdirection. Maya was quiet for a moment. "What does your gut say?" "My gut says that Dylan Mercer has been in this office for 6 weeks, and he's a good director, and none of this is his fault, and I have a document that proves it, and I should submit the document." "Then submit the document." "And if it costs me my job? Does it feel like the kind of thing that would cost you your job?" She thought about the email chain, about what it said, about the fact that it existed in the company's own filing system, that she hadn't manufactured it or found it outside proper channels, that it was a legitimate business record she'd retrieved in the course of a legitimate documentation request. "No," she said slowly, "I don't think it costs me my job. I think it potentially costs Richard Hollis his job." "Then submit the document," Maya said, for the third time, in the tone of someone who has been patient but is done being uncertain on someone else's behalf. Claire submitted the document. She did it through the formal review submission channel, accompanied by a written summary explaining the context in which she'd found it and what it appeared to show. She wrote the summary carefully, 3 times, removing anything that sounded like interpretation and keeping only what the document itself demonstrated. She submitted it at 9:17 a.m. on a Friday and then went back to her desk and opened the Harrington post-opening report she was supposed to be finishing and read the same paragraph 4 times without retaining any of it. Ben stopped by her desk at 10. "You look like someone who did something that can't be undone," he said. "I submitted additional documentation to the Alcott review," she said. He looked at her with the careful expression of someone calibrating how much to ask. "Anything I should know about?" "Probably not yet," she said. "Maybe later." He nodded once, the nod of someone who understood that some information arrived on a schedule it set itself, and went back to his desk. The rest of that Friday moved with the specific slowness of time that is waiting for something, though Claire couldn't have said exactly what she was waiting for. A response from the review coordinator, maybe. An email from Chicago. Something that would tell her whether what she'd done had registered or disappeared into the system or triggered something she wasn't prepared for. Nothing came by end of day. She drove home in the rain, always Seattle, and ate leftover soup and tried to watch something on television and gave up and went to bed early and slept badly again. Saturday was better, marginally. She went for a run in the morning, which was something she did when she needed to move her body because her mind was doing something she couldn't stop. Seattle in late November was cold and wet, and the run was not pleasant, but it was real in a way that her apartment and her anxiety weren't, and she came back an hour later with cold legs and a clearer head. She was 2 blocks from her building when she saw the text from an unknown number. It said, "This is Dylan. I got a call from the review coordinator this morning. I think you know why. Can we talk Monday?" She stood on the wet sidewalk in her running clothes and read the text twice. She texted back, "Yes." He responded, "Thank you." She didn't know what to do with that either, so she pocketed her phone and walked the last 2 blocks home and stood under a hot shower for a long time, thinking about the gap between what you know you should do and how it feels in your body to actually do it, which is rarely as clean as the decision itself. Monday arrived, and with it a quality of tension in the office that was different from the tension of the previous weeks. Not worse, necessarily, but different. The tension of something moving rather than something static. The review had clearly progressed over the weekend. There were 2 new faces on the 5th floor that no one recognized, and the executive assistant from Chicago who had been coordinating the review was moving with more purpose than she had been the week before. Dylan appeared in the design suite at 9:30 and asked Claire to come upstairs. His office was on the 5th floor, a corner room with windows on 2 sides that looked out at the Puget Sound on clear days, though today was not a clear day and the windows showed only gray. He had his legal pad and his coffee and a file folder that looked like it had been handled multiple times. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly, more like someone who had a specific conversation to have and wanted to be seated for it. She sat. He looked at her for a moment. "The email chain you submitted, the one between Weston and Hollis." Weston was the interim director's name. She nodded. "Where did you find it?" "In the Alcott Project Correspondence Archive. I was pulling records for the documentation request, the records related to the early concept work I did on the interior brand. The email chain was in the same archive folder. I found it in the process of going through the materials." "You read it?" "I read enough to understand what it was." "And you submitted it?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a gull moved past the window, visible for a second and then gone. "You know what's in that email chain from a corporate politics standpoint?" "I know what it appears to show. It shows that a senior VP of capital allocation at corporate headquarters authorized a scope change with a former regional director and then explicitly deferred the budget documentation in a way that guaranteed the cost would appear as a regional overrun rather than a corporate decision. He said it plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact you've had time to process. It shows that Richard Hollis made a decision that was going to cost someone at the regional level, and the way it was documented made sure that cost wouldn't be traceable back to Chicago." "Yes," Claire said. "That's what it shows." "Which means you submitted a document that implicates a senior VP." "Yes." "Knowing what that might mean for you professionally." "I submitted a legitimate business record that I found in the course of a documentation request," she said. "I didn't manufacture it. I didn't seek it out. I found it, and I submitted it because it was relevant, and because—" She stopped, started again. "Because it was true. It was the truth and it was relevant, and not submitting, it felt like a choice I couldn't make." Dylan looked at her for a long moment. She had the feeling again. The same feeling she'd had in the elevator, in conference rooms, at the coffee station, of being genuinely seen rather than assessed. "The review team is going to want to talk to you," he said, not in a punitive way. "They need to document the chain of custody, where the email was, how you found it, that it was accessed through legitimate channels." "I know, that's fine. It might get complicated before it gets less complicated." "I know that too." "Why?" he asked. Not why did you submit it? He'd understood that from what she'd said, something more specific. "Why does it matter to you? This isn't your project. Your exposure to Alcott was minimal. You could have submitted your own records and never looked at anything else in that folder. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the gray window and then back at him. Because you've been here 6 weeks, she said, and you've spent those 6 weeks actually doing the work, fixing things, listening to people, doing the thing that... She stopped, aware that she was about to say something that referenced a conversation she'd had with a man she'd believed was a maintenance worker, which was a layer of irony she wasn't sure either of them needed to excavate right now. Doing the thing that I think good leadership is actually supposed to look like. And the idea that you were going to take the weight of something that wasn't yours because someone else made sure the paperwork pointed at you. She shook her head. I couldn't not submit it. That's the honest answer. The office was very quiet. The rain tapped at the windows. Dylan put his legal pad down. He looked at her with an expression that she couldn't categorize cleanly. Not gratitude exactly, though there was some of that, and not surprise, though there was some of that too. Something more considered than either. I was going to resign, he said. She looked at him. What? Before the weekend, before I knew about the email chain. He said it simply, not for effect. The review was pointing at the regional office, at me, specifically, as the director of record. I knew I hadn't made those decisions, but I couldn't prove it, and spending months fighting a narrative while the office dealt with the fallout, I didn't think that was the right choice for the team. You were going to resign for something you didn't do. Huh? I was going to resign to stop it from being something the entire office had to carry while I defended myself. He paused. It seemed like the more useful option at the time. Claire thought about that, about the fact that she'd gotten up on a Friday morning and written a careful summary of what an email chain showed and clicked submit, and on the other side of that click, a man had been standing in a corner office looking at a resignation letter. I'm glad I submitted it, she said. So am I, he said, for what it's worth. The review team met with Claire on Tuesday afternoon. There were 2 of them, a woman named Patricia from corporate legal and a man named Gerard from internal audit. And they were thorough without being hostile. They walked her through the exact sequence of events: the documentation request, the archive folder, the email chain. They asked her twice whether she'd been directed to look for the email by anyone else, and she said no both times because it was true. They asked whether she'd discussed the contents of the email with Director Mercer before submitting it, and she said no, because that was also true. She'd submitted it before she knew he'd been told about it. By Thursday, the information had moved upward through channels Claire couldn't follow, and the 2 unknown faces on the 5th floor had been joined by a 3rd, and the executive assistant from Chicago was on the phone in a conference room for most of the afternoon with the door closed. What filtered down to the general office level was the specific kind of rumor that travels fast because it's adjacent to something real, that the review had found something significant, that it wasn't what people had expected, that someone at the corporate level was having a very difficult week. On Friday afternoon, an email went to all Northwest Division staff from the corporate review coordinator. It said that the Alcott project review had concluded and that the findings had been shared with the relevant parties. It said that the division had cooperated fully with the review process. It said that any further communication would come through appropriate channels. It said, notably, nothing about the regional director, which was its own kind of answer. Claire was at her desk reading the email for the second time when she heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to find Dylan standing in the doorway of the design suite. He looked at her directly, with the same composure he brought to everything, but there was something different in it today. Not relief exactly, but the absence of a weight. The review is concluded, he said. I saw the email, she said. He nodded. He looked like he had more to say, and was deciding how to say it in the middle of an open office. Can you come upstairs for a minute? She followed him up. In his office, he stood at the window rather than sitting, looking out at the Sound, which was visible today for the first time in what felt like weeks, a stripe of dark water between the buildings and the sky. Corporate has confirmed the findings, he said. The budget discrepancy originated in decisions made above the regional level and was improperly attributed. The responsible parties are being addressed separately. A pause. I'm staying. I'm glad, she said. I've been offered an additional division, he said. The Montana and Idaho properties, expanded role. He turned from the window, which will change my position here. She wasn't sure she understood what he meant. Change how? The expanded role is a promotion. I'll be overseeing multiple regions, which means I won't be the direct regional director for the Northwest on a day-to-day basis. There'll be a new director for the Northwest office, reporting to me rather than to Chicago. She sat with that for a moment. So you won't be your direct superior, he said. No, not in the same way. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for what felt like a meaningful duration. Congratulations, she said. Thank you. He paused. Claire, his phone rang. He looked at the screen and she could see from the expression that it was the kind of call he had to take. Later, he said, which was not a complete sentence, and picked up the phone. She left his office and walked back to the elevator and went down to 4 and sat at her desk and tried to figure out what she was feeling, which was complicated by the fact that she was feeling several things simultaneously, and they didn't all point in the same direction. He was no longer going to be her direct boss. That was a fact that had arrived wrapped in a promotion. His promotion, deserved, the kind of outcome you'd hope for when you submitted a document into a review process, because it was true and relevant and right. That part was good. The outcome was good. The other part, the part that was harder to name, was that she had spent 6 weeks carefully managing a clear professional boundary, and that boundary was in the process of shifting, and she didn't entirely know what came next on the other side of it. Ben rolled his chair over to her desk at 4:30. So, he said. So, she said. He's staying. He's staying and getting a promotion, which is good. It's very good. And you're the reason the review went the way it did. She looked at him. I submitted documentation. You submitted documentation that changed everything. He said it without fuss, the way he said most things. People know, Claire. The office knows. Maybe not the specifics, but people who've been here long enough understand what happened. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. You did a good thing, Ben said simply. That's all. He rolled his chair back to his desk. Claire turned back to her monitor. Outside the windows, Seattle was doing what it always did at this hour in late November, going dark early, the kind of dark that arrived before 5 and settled in with complete confidence. The streetlights came on below, and the rain, which had stopped for most of the day, started again lightly, the way it did when it wasn't trying to make a statement. She thought about the lobby of the Harrington Hotel, the high windows and the afternoon light, the things she'd said in the elevator about spaces that communicate something before you've consciously processed what you're looking at. She thought about 6 weeks of evidence accumulating against the story she'd walked into this building with on a Monday morning in October, about the distance between the confident judgment she'd delivered to a stranger in a broken elevator and the actual person that stranger had turned out to be. She thought about the word later, which was not a complete sentence and which sat in her brain with the specific weight of something that was not finished. She packed up her bag at 5:15, turned off her monitor, and put on her coat. The elevator down to the lobby was empty and ran smoothly all the way. The word later turned out to have a specific timeline attached to it, which was the following Monday morning at 8:40, when Dylan appeared in the doorway of the design suite before most of the team had arrived and asked if she had 10 minutes. She had 10 minutes. They went to the small conference room at the end of the 4th-floor hallway, the one that didn't have glass walls, that was used mostly for one-on-one calls and the occasional conversation that needed to happen without an audience. He closed the door, and they sat across from each other at a table that was slightly too big for 2 people and had a whiteboard on the wall behind him that still had remnants of someone's project timeline from 2 weeks ago, imperfectly erased. I wanted to say something properly, he said, not in the middle of a phone call. Okay, she said. What you did, finding that email chain and submitting it, I want you to understand what that actually changed. You told me you were going to resign, she said. I understand what it changed. Not just for me. He said it evenly, not dramatically. The Northwest office has 43 people. If I'd resigned under a cloud, the review findings would have stayed ambiguous, and the office would have carried that ambiguity for however long it took corporate to sort it out. And in the meantime, the people here would have been operating under the uncertainty of whether the place was going to be restructured or shut down or absorbed into another region. 43 people. He paused. You changed that for 43 people by doing something that cost you something. It didn't cost me that much, she said. It could have. She acknowledged that with a small nod because it was true and pretending otherwise would have been dishonest. And she had a general policy against being dishonest with him that had developed somewhere over the past 6 weeks without her explicitly deciding to adopt it. You said the role is changing, she said. The expanded position. Effective January 1st, I'll be Regional Director for Northwest Montana and Idaho, which is more geography than one person manages well from a single office. Corporate wants me based here for the first quarter and then will assess whether Seattle stays the primary office or whether I split time. He had his legal pad, as always, though he hadn't written anything on it yet today. The new Northwest Pacific Director will be announced before the end of December. The reporting structure changes, but the day-to-day of the office continues. Who's the new director? That's still being determined. He looked at her. I want to be transparent about something. I'm not involved in that decision in a way that would be appropriate given some other things. HR in Chicago are handling it. She understood what he meant by some other things, even though he hadn't said it directly, and the understanding of it sat in her chest in a way that was warm and also complicated, the way most things were when they were real rather than theoretical. Okay, she said. I also want to be transparent about the other thing, he said. He said it like someone who has practiced being direct and still finds specific situations harder than others. Which is that I'm aware there's a professional dimension to what I'm about to say that I've been navigating carefully and intend to keep navigating carefully. She waited. In the elevator, he said, the first night. I didn't tell you who I was. I know. I should have told you. I've thought about that. He looked at the table briefly, then back at her. I've done this before. Coming into a new office without announcing myself, seeing how things work when people aren't performing for a director. It's useful information, but usually I correct it within the first hour. I didn't correct it with you, and I've been trying to figure out whether that was a decision or something else. What did you decide? That it was something else, he said. You were talking, and I was listening, and the conversation was, it was the most honest conversation I'd had with anyone in that office, and I didn't want to end it by making it weird, which is not a great justification. It's a human justification, she said. He looked at her with something that was close to relief, though he kept it contained. You were also right, he said, about most of it. The things you said about what good leadership should look like. The things about executives who come in with decisions already made. I've been that person in earlier positions, and I didn't like recognizing it when you described it. She hadn't expected him to say that. You've been different here. I've been trying to be different. He said it without false modesty, just accuracy. There's a difference. I know, she said. I've been watching. The small conference room was quiet. Outside in the hallway, she could hear someone arriving, keys on a desk, a bag being set down. The normal sounds of a Monday morning assembling itself. I'm aware, Dylan said, that I'm your superior, and that until the new director is in place, that's still the structure. I'm not going to pretend I don't know that there's, he stopped and chose the next words carefully, that there's something here that I'd like to talk about when it's appropriate to talk about it. I'm not asking you for anything right now, I just didn't want to not say that. Claire looked at him for a long moment. There was something clarifying about the way he said things, the absence of performance in it, the refusal to dress up what he meant in language that gave him an exit. She'd noticed it from the beginning, in a broken elevator, when she'd thought she was talking to a maintenance worker, and he'd asked her what she thought made a good leader. I appreciate you saying it, she said, and I appreciate that you know why we're not having a different conversation right now. I do know, he said. I want to be clear about that. You're clear, she said. He nodded once, the kind of nod that closed something without pretending it was fully resolved. He picked up his legal pad. She pushed back her chair. One more thing, he said, as she stood. She waited. My daughter's name is Nora. He said it like a non sequitur, which it was, though it didn't feel like one. She's 6. She's been asking me every morning what kind of building I work in, and I've been describing it. And last week she asked if the person who made the colors of the rooms was nice. He looked at her with an expression that was direct and slightly helpless, in the way of people who love their children visibly. I didn't know what to say. Claire's chest did something she didn't have a name for. "What did you tell her?" she said. "I said yes." He said it simply. She seemed satisfied with that. Claire nodded. She left the conference room and walked back to her desk and sat down and stared at her monitor for about 30 seconds before opening her email, which required a conscious act of will. Priya arrived at 9:15, dropped her bag, and looked at Claire with the expression of someone who has noticed something and is deciding whether to mention it. "Don't," Claire said. "I didn't say anything." "Your face said something." "My face is completely neutral." "Priya." "You look like someone who had a good meeting," Priya said, in the tone of a person who had agreed not to say anything and was technically honoring that agreement. She sat down and turned to her monitor. Completely neutral observation. December arrived in Seattle the way December always did, earlier than felt reasonable, with shortened days and a specific quality of cold that was different from November cold, less ambiguous about its intentions. The Meridian Pacific Northwest office settled into the rhythms of a month that was simultaneously end of year and mid-project, with the Harrington post-opening documentation to close out, two smaller projects in late stages, and the Alcott project continuing its now considerably less fraught path under a revised management structure. Richard Hollis had been placed on administrative leave pending a formal internal investigation, which was the corporate version of a consequence that might eventually become a larger one, or might not, depending on things that were above Claire's level and about which she had chosen not to speculate too loudly. The important thing, as Ben put it with his characteristic concision, was that the right people were looking at the right documents. Dylan's announcement of the expanded role went out to the full organization the second week of December. It was framed straightforwardly, a recognition of strong operational leadership, an expansion of responsibilities, effective January 1st. The internal communications team had probably written a version of it that was considerably more elaborate, and he'd asked them to simplify it, which was Claire's theory, though she had no evidence for it. She saw him in the office regularly throughout December. He was still the director of record for the Northwest Division, still running the daily operations, still appearing in the kitchen at 7 a.m. with a communal pot coffee and a legal pad. But the quality of their interactions had shifted in a way that was subtle and probably invisible to most people, and very visible to Claire, which was that they both knew something existed in a space they had agreed to leave alone for now, and that agreeing to leave it alone was itself a kind of acknowledgement. They had good conversations. They had always had good conversations, which was something Claire had identified early and then tried not to think about too directly. They had conversations about the Harrington Post opening data, guest feedback, visual impact assessments, the client's interest in commissioning a second property in the same aesthetic language. They had a conversation about a new hotel concept that the design team was pitching in January that Claire was leading, and Dylan had questions that were good questions, and the conversation ran 45 minutes instead of the 15 it was scheduled for. One afternoon he mentioned Nora in passing, something about a school project involving the Seattle waterfront, which Nora had apparently decided to document in photographs because she'd seen pictures of the Harrington on his laptop and developed an interest in the relationship between buildings and water. Claire had smiled at that in a way she hadn't been able to fully contain, and Dylan had noticed and looked like he was containing something similar. The new Northwest director was announced December 19th. Her name was Sandra Osei, and she was coming from the Phoenix regional office, and she was by all accounts excellent, and she would be starting January 6th, a week after Dylan's new role became official. Claire read the announcement at her desk and felt a very specific mixture of things. Professional relief, because Sandra Osei's credentials were solid and the office needed strong leadership at the direct level. Personal awareness, because the professional boundary she'd been maintaining for 6 weeks was about to change its shape. She was at her desk late that evening, not unusually late, maybe 6:30, finishing the final documentation package on the Harrington project when she heard the now familiar pattern of Dylan's footsteps in the hallway. She had learned, without intending to, the sound of how he walked. It was an unremarkable thing to know about a person and also, somehow, not. He appeared in the doorway. He was in his coat, which meant he was on his way out. "You're finishing the Harrington closeout," he said. It wasn't a question. "Last package. I want it done before the holidays." He looked at the stack of documents on her desk. The organized version of 8 months of work reduced to its administrative final form. How does it feel? She thought about it honestly. Like being finished with something I put a lot into, which is good. And also, she gestured vaguely. There's always a moment at the end of a project where you wonder if you made the right calls. If the version you made is the version you meant to make. Is it? She looked at the Harrington board leaning against the wall beside her desk. She'd brought it back from the site for the closeout documentation. The lobby rendering, the industrial warmth, the afternoon light. "Mostly," she said, "the mezzanine workspace was better than I thought it would be, and the Portland fixtures were actually better than the original spec, which I didn't expect." She paused. "The things that went wrong mostly made it better, which I know sounds like a rationalization, but I think is actually true." "It doesn't sound like a rationalization," he said. "It sounds like 8 months of paying attention." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway the way he often stood in doorways, not quite committing to entering a space which she had come to understand was not hesitation, but consideration. He decided before he moved. "Sandra Osei," she said. "She's good," he said. "You'll like working with her." "I'm sure." He held her gaze for a moment. "January 7th, he said. Her first full day." "I know, I read the announcement." "Which would make January 6th the last day of the current structure," she said. "Yes," he said. A pause that was not empty. "I have a reservation," he said, "at a restaurant near the waterfront, January 6th. I made it this morning." He said it without elaborate framing, which was entirely consistent with how he said everything. "If you'd like to have dinner." Claire looked at him. She thought about October, about a broken elevator and a stranger with a toolbox, about the confidence with which she'd described a person she'd never met, about 6 weeks of being wrong in the most instructive way possible. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." He nodded. The nod of someone who had asked a real question and received a real answer and was taking both seriously. 7 o'clock. I'll send you the address." "Okay," she said. He said goodnight and left, and Claire turned back to her desk and the Harrington closeout package and sat for a moment just sitting, not thinking anything very organized, just aware of the particular feeling of a thing that had been carefully deferred finally having a date attached to it. She finished the documentation at 7:15, packed it into the submission folder, and shut down her computer. The holiday break passed the way holiday breaks do when you're waiting for something that starts in January, quickly in the parts involving other people and slowly in the parts involving your own head. She spent Christmas with her family in Tacoma, which was her parents and her older brother and his wife and their 2 kids who were 6 and 4 and operated at a noise level that made it impossible to think about anything else, which was useful. She ran on 3 of the 4 mornings and called Maya twice and did not think about January 6th more than a moderate amount, which she considered a reasonable accomplishment given the circumstances. She texted Dylan once on December 27th because she'd seen something, a photograph in an architecture magazine at her parents' house, a hotel lobby in Copenhagen, reclaimed industrial materials, afternoon light through high windows, and had taken a picture of it before she fully decided to, and then sent it to him before she thought too hard about whether to. She wrote, "This made me think of Harrington, the Copenhagen version." He responded 20 minutes later with, "Better or worse?" She wrote back, "Different. They went for colder. I think we made the right call." He sent back, "Agreed." And then, a minute later, "How's your Christmas?" She looked at that message for a moment. It was a simple question, the kind that people asked each other, and also the first non-work-related direct communication they'd had. And somehow both of those things were true at the same time. "Loud," she wrote back. "My nephew found a drum kit under the tree. We're all managing." His response came quickly. "Nora got a science kit. I have been informed that we are going to grow crystals." She laughed out loud in her parents' kitchen, genuinely, the kind of laugh that surprised her. Her mother looked over from the counter. "What?" her mother said. "Nothing," Claire said. "Work thing." Her mother looked at her with the specific expression that mothers develop for recognizing when their adult children are lying about something being a work thing, and then went back to what she was doing. "That is an excellent gift," Claire wrote. "More excellent for her than for the kitchen table, probably," Dylan wrote back. She smiled at her phone. "Happy holidays," she wrote. "Happy holidays," he wrote. "See you in January." She went back to her family's Christmas with a warmth in her chest that she acknowledged privately and didn't examine too closely because some things were better held lightly until there was room to hold them properly. January 6th arrived on a Tuesday, which felt like the right day of the week for something that had been precisely 6 weeks and 1 day in the making. The office was back from the break, and there was the particular energy of a first week back, slightly slow, coffee-dependent, full of the specific kind of catching up that involved asking people how their holidays were and genuinely wanting to know. Sandra Osei had come in Monday for orientation, had met the team, walked the floors, spent time with HR and with Dylan in the 5th floor conference room, and had made, as far as Claire could tell, a strong first impression. She was direct and specific and had asked Ben Kowalski 3 detailed questions about the Alcott project remediation plan that were the right 3 questions, which was the fastest way to tell whether someone understood what they were walking into. Dylan spent most of Tuesday in transition meetings. Claire saw him twice in the hallway, both times briefly, both times with the low-key awareness of a person who has a specific thing happening at 7 p.m. and is not thinking about it more than necessary. At 4:30, she went to the bathroom to check that she looked like a person who had been at work all day in a normal and professional way, which she did, though she had also, she admitted to herself, worn the dark green dress that she owned for occasions that were slightly more than ordinary. The dark green dress was under her work blazer and no one had commented on it, which was the ideal outcome. At 5:15, she packed up her desk. Ben looked over. "Big plans?" "Dinner," she said. "Nice." He went back to his monitor, then looked back. "With?" "A friend," she said. "Okay," he said, in the same agreeable tone Priya used when she was exercising significant restraint. She took the elevator down. Same elevator. Running smoothly, as it had been since October, the relay board presumably long since replaced. She stood in it and thought about the first time, and the complete absence of information she'd had about what was on the other side of that evening. The lobby was quiet. The security guard at his desk with a book, the marble floor recently buffed and reflecting the overhead lights in elongated pale ovals. She pushed through the glass door into the January air, which was cold in the specific Seattle way of cold that is damp as well as cold and reminds you that the sound is very close. Dylan was standing outside. He'd changed at some point in the afternoon, not dramatically. Same kind of suit, different tie, the coat he wore when the weather was serious about itself. He was looking at his phone when she came out and looked up when the door opened. There was a moment, brief, unremarkable from the outside, where they just looked at each other on the sidewalk in the January dark, the streetlights on, the city doing its thing around them, and something that had been carefully held at a specific distance for 6 weeks was no longer being held at that distance. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. Not director and employee, not the careful professional register they'd been operating in, just 2 people on a sidewalk. "The restaurant's about 4 blocks, he said. "We can walk," or "Walk," she said. The cold air was real, and she wanted real. They walked. The waterfront was 2 blocks south, and they could smell it. The salt and the industrial edge of the Sound in winter. The restaurant was on a corner, small, the kind of place with warm light visible through the windows from the street, and a handwritten menu board and no corporate design language anywhere in its bones. "This is nice," she said, when they'd been seated and she'd had a moment to look at the room. The exposed brick, the mismatched chairs, the candles that were actual candles rather than the battery-operated version. "Not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She considered being diplomatic and decided against it. Something more corporate, impressive in a way that was trying to be impressive. "I've been to enough of those," he said. "They're tiring." She picked up the menu. "What's good?" "I've only been here once before. The pasta, I think." And they make their own bread. You've only been here once? I made the reservation this morning, he said. I had a recommendation from someone in property management, Ben, actually. She looked up from the menu. You asked Ben for a restaurant recommendation. I asked him where he'd take someone for a first dinner that wasn't trying too hard, Dylan said. He gave me 3 options. This was the first one. She thought about Ben at his desk, receiving this question from the regional director, and the expression Ben must have produced in response to it, and felt a complicated surge of affection for Ben's composure. He didn't say anything to me. I asked him not to. He's very discreet. He's also very efficient. He sent me the recommendations within 4 minutes with notes on parking and whether reservations were necessary. Claire laughed. That's Ben, they ordered. The bread arrived, real bread, the kind with a crust and heft to it, and the wine Dylan had ordered was good without being ostentatious, and the restaurant had the quality of a place that knew exactly what it was and wasn't trying to be anything else, which she appreciated more than she might have 6 months ago. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. The first night, the elevator. You came in after hours dressed the way you were dressed, with a toolbox. Was any of that planned? He thought about it. The visiting without announcing myself part was planned. The elevator was, I was actually on my way to look at a maintenance issue someone had flagged, the relay board problem. I'd seen it in the facilities report. He looked at her. I do that. Look at things in facilities reports. It tells you what's been deferred and why, and that tells you something about how the operation prioritizes maintenance versus optics. So you genuinely fixed the elevator. I made a temporary fix. The relay board was replaced the following week. He paused. The toolbox is mine. I've had it since I was 22. She looked at him. Why? My first job was in facilities management for a commercial property company. I was 22, just out of school, needed money, took what was available. I was terrible at it for the first 6 months and then got better at it. And by the time I left, I could diagnose most building systems issues faster than the contracted maintenance team. He picked up his wine glass. I left because I got into a business program. And I took the toolbox with me because, I don't know, it seemed important to keep. Because it reminded you where you started. Because it reminded me that most problems have a physical reality. Something is broken, or it isn't. Something works, or it needs to be fixed. I've spent a lot of years in rooms where people talk about problems without ever touching them, and I've found it useful to remember what it feels like to touch the actual problem. She sat with that for a moment, the bread warm in her hands and the restaurant noise a comfortable low murmur around them. You know, she said, everything I said in the elevator, about executives who never fixed anything, about people who look at spreadsheets instead of problems. I remember, he said, without any indication of whether it had stung. You were literally holding a toolbox, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Yes, with grease on your knuckles. There was a lot going on in that relay board. And I told you to your face, I said your name. I described you as someone who had never done a real day of work. You also said some things about what good leadership should look like, he said. That part I found more useful to hold on to. She shook her head. Not in embarrassment exactly, though there was some of that, more in the acknowledgement of how completely wrong and how specifically revealing it was to be wrong in the way she'd been wrong. I owe you an apology for that, a real one. You really don't. I do. You were honest about what you were afraid of, he said. And most of what you were afraid of was legitimate. Plenty of people in my position have done exactly what you described. The concern wasn't wrong. The specific application was off. Still, he agreed mildly. If it matters, I wasn't offended. I was interested. In you, specifically. In the person who would say those things to a stranger in a broken elevator without any filter. He looked at her directly. That takes a kind of honesty that most people don't have in comfortable situations, let alone anxious ones. The food arrived and saved them both from the moment getting heavier than the restaurant required, and the conversation moved to the Copenhagen hotel photograph, to Nora's crystal growing project, which had apparently produced results that were better than expected and considerably messier, to Claire's January pitch project, to a building Dylan had seen in Portland over the break that he thought she'd have opinions about and described in enough detail that she did have opinions about it. It was the kind of dinner where time moved incorrectly, faster than you wanted it to, slower in the moments that deserved to be slower. She ate actual food and drank actual wine and sat across from a person who listened when she talked about things she cared about, and the combination of these ordinary facts produced something in her that was the furthest thing from ordinary. At one point he said, "You should know the full picture of what I do, professionally." She looked at him. "Okay." "Meridian Pacific Northwest is one division," he said. "The expanded role covers 3 regions. But the company I work for, the parent company, is larger than the regional structure suggests." He said it without preamble or inflation. "My family started it. I took over the operational side at 28 after my father stepped back from day-to-day management. The portfolio it's substantial." She processed that. "How substantial?" He told her. The number was not what she'd expected. The number was significantly not what she'd expected, in the specific way of a number that puts a person in a category that most people only read about. She looked at him across the table. He looked back. He hadn't said it with pride or with apology. He'd said it the way he said most things, with the plainness of someone who has learned that the information itself, delivered without decoration, was more respectful than any framing of it. "You came into the building with a toolbox," she said. "The building needed its elevator fixed," he said. She laughed, a real one, sudden, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. And he smiled, the full version of it, the one she'd seen in pieces over 6 weeks and not yet seen assembled completely, and it turned out to be a good smile. Uncomplicated. Real. "I don't—" She started and stopped. "I want to say that it doesn't change anything, and I think that's true. But I also think saying it immediately sounds like the thing people say without meaning it." "Does it change anything?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, about the toolbox and the legal pad and the coffee from the communal pot and the question he'd asked in the broken elevator about what she thought good leadership actually meant, about Nora and the crystal kit and the school pickup that was non-negotiable. "No," she said. "But I want you to know that's a considered answer and not a reflexive one." "I know," he said. "That's why I told you here instead of in a conference room." They left the restaurant at 9:30, which was later than she'd realized, and stood on the sidewalk in the cold January air, the waterfront 2 blocks away making itself known by smell and sound. "I'm glad you said yes," he said. "To dinner." "I'm glad you asked," she said, in the least corporate way possible. "Ben's restaurant recommendation system is very reliable. I'm going to tell him you said that, and he's going to be insufferably pleased. He's earned it." Dylan looked at her. "Can I drive you to your car?" "I'm in the structure on 3rd. "I'm in the structure on 3rd, he said. Of course he was. She shook her head. "Then yes. You can walk me to my car." They walked. The night was cold and the city was a city in January, which meant it was quieter than it would be in other months, less performing of itself. The parking structure smelled like all parking structures, concrete and exhaust and a specific variety of institutional lighting. And they rode the elevator to level 2, which was where she always parked, and where, it turned out, he was also parked. A few spaces down from hers in a car that was a reliable, unremarkable sedan that she had not expected and then immediately had expected. At her car she turned and he was right there. Not far, the kind of close that was a decision rather than an accident. "January 7th, he said. "New structure." "New structure," she agreed. He looked at her in the particular way he had of looking at her. Direct, without deflection, as though he'd decided to actually see her rather than manage her at a professional remove. "I wanted to say one more thing." "Okay." "I know this is new, and I'm aware of everything that's complicated about it." He chose the words with care, not stilted care, but the care of someone who understood that precision mattered here. "I'm not in a hurry. I just want to be honest about where I am, which is that I've been thinking about that elevator for 2.5 months, and tonight was the best version of what I hoped it would be." Claire looked at him. She thought about all the versions of this moment she might have imagined at various points in the past 2.5 months, and the degree to which this version, a parking structure, honest words, no performance, was better than any of them. "Me too," she said. He nodded. She got in her car. He stood on the concrete level 2 floor until her engine caught, and then moved toward his own car, and she pulled out of the space and down the ramp and out into the January night. The drive home was quiet. She didn't call Maya. She didn't need to process it aloud yet. It was still close enough that processing it felt like it would disturb something that needed to settle first. She got home and took off the dark green dress and hung it up and made herself tea and sat on her couch with the cup warm in both hands and thought about the Harrington lobby and the high windows and the light she'd spent 8 months trying to get right. She thought about 2.5 months of evidence building against the story she'd walked in with. She thought about a man with a toolbox and a legal pad and a daughter who was going to grow crystals on the kitchen table and who had asked whether the person who made the colors of the rooms was nice. She thought about the word yes, which she had said clearly and meant completely, and which felt, sitting with her tea in the January quiet of her apartment, like the truest thing she'd said in a long time. Sandra Osei arrived on a Wednesday, which was 1 day later than announced because her flight from Phoenix had been delayed by weather, and she walked into the Northwest office at 9 a.m. with a rolling carry-on she hadn't had time to drop at her hotel and the specific energy of someone who had been traveling since 5 in the morning and was going to be fully operational anyway. Claire liked her within the first hour, not in the uncomplicated way of meeting someone who is obviously likable, but in the more useful way of meeting someone whose mind worked in a manner she respected. Sandra asked the kind of questions that revealed she'd already done significant homework, and she listened to the answers with the same quality of attention that Claire had come to associate with people who were actually going to do something with the information rather than just collect it. By the end of Sandra's first week, the office had reached a verdict on her that was as close to unanimous as office verdicts ever got, which was that she was competent, direct, and willing to be told things that were inconvenient. Ben said she reminded him of a very organized weather system. Priya said she'd never felt so efficiently onboarded in her life. Marcus from IT said she'd approved the VPN upgrade request that had been pending for 8 months, which in Marcus's personal hierarchy of approval metrics placed her somewhere close to the top. The transition was real work. Claire understood this in a way that was more than abstract, because the transition involved a reorganization of the project lead structure that Sandra implemented in her second week, and it affected Claire directly. The new pitch project, the January concept Claire had been developing, was elevated to a full divisional priority, which meant more resources and a larger team, but also a more formal review structure and a presentation to Sandra and the finance leads at the end of the month. It also meant more visibility, which Claire had mixed feelings about in the way that people have mixed feelings about things they want and are also nervous about wanting. She and Dylan talked about it on a Thursday evening in mid-January over takeout containers in the living room of her apartment, which had become a thing that happened. Thursday evenings mostly, because his Mondays were always long and Fridays he tried to keep for Nora, and Thursdays had fallen into place as the night that belonged to neither of those categories and was therefore available for other things. It was, she had to admit, a strange and good thing to have Thursday evenings. "The visibility is the point," he said, pulling noodles from a container with the chopsticks he'd appropriated from her kitchen drawer. He was better with chopsticks than she was, which she'd found mildly irritating and then stopped being irritated about. "You've been doing this level of work for 2 years. The visibility is what was missing." "Visibility also means being wrong in front of more people," she said. "You've been wrong in front of people before. In smaller rooms. The room doesn't change how wrong you are. It just changes the audience." He looked at her. "You're not going to be wrong. You don't know that. I know the project. I've seen the concept." He said it plainly, the way he said most things. "You're not going to be wrong. You might make mistakes. That's different. Mistakes are recoverable. Being fundamentally wrong about what the work is supposed to do is what matters, and you're not." She thought about that, about the distinction between being wrong and making mistakes, which was the kind of distinction that sounded like wordplay until you sat with it long enough to understand that it wasn't. "Sandra's good," Claire said. "I know." She figured out the Alcott remediation structure faster than I expected. She had the contractor conversation in her second week, and it went better than any of the previous 3 conversations about the same issue. She's also not going to take things on the chin because someone above her documented something wrong, Dylan said. Which is a thing you should know about her going in. She's protective of her office. Good, Claire said. The office needs that. He nodded. He looked at the takeout containers on the coffee table with the expression of someone who was thinking about something adjacent to the current conversation. I got confirmation today about the first quarter schedule, he said. The 3-region role means I'll be traveling more. Montana first. There's a property in Bozeman that needs a full operational review, then Idaho in March. She looked at him. How much travel? First quarter, probably 1 week a month out of Seattle. Maybe 1.5. That's manageable. It gets heavier in Q2 depending on how the Bozeman review goes. He met her eyes. I'm telling you because I want to be realistic about what the schedule looks like rather than optimistic and then wrong. This was a thing she had come to understand about him. He told you the difficult version of information preemptively, not because he was pessimistic, but because he'd been on the receiving end of optimistic projections that turned out to be wrong, and had learned to prefer the truth even when it was less comfortable. It was a quality that had annoyed her once, in a different context, when she'd expected reassurance and received accuracy instead. She'd stopped expecting reassurance. The accuracy was better. Okay, she said. Tell me when the schedule solidifies. I will. He picked up his container again. Nora asked about you. She looked up. About me specifically? She asked if you were coming to the crystal display. He said it with the careful neutrality of a person delivering information and consciously not loading it with more weight than the recipient was ready for. She finished the kit. The kitchen table survived mostly. She set up a display in the living room and is inviting people. Claire thought about a 6-year-old who grew crystals in her father's kitchen and held display events for them. When's the display? Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock. He looked at her. You don't have to. She's also inviting her teacher and the neighbor who has a dog she likes. So the company will be... I'd like to go, Claire said. He was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone receiving something they'd hoped for but hadn't assumed. Okay, he said. What kind of crystals? Copper sulfate mostly. They're blue. She's very proud of the blue ones. A pause. She's been asking me to explain the science, and I've been explaining it, and she corrects me when I get it wrong. Does she correct you often? More than is statistically likely, he said, with the expression of a man who had been corrected by a 6-year-old and found it both humbling and completely wonderful, and was not going to say so directly, but also was not managing to hide it. Claire looked at him across the coffee table with its takeout containers and the Seattle winter visible through the window behind him, the city dark and lit and wet in the way it always was, and thought about the elevator again, about the complete absence of information she'd had about what was on the other side of that door when it opened. She thought about the word later, which had turned out to mean exactly what it said. Saturday arrived with the specific quality of Saturday in January, which was not good weather, but was at least different weather from weekday weather. The same rain, but with nowhere particular to be in it. She took the bus to Dylan's neighborhood rather than driving, because she was nervous, and driving when nervous was something she'd decided years ago not to do, and the bus gave her something external to pay attention to. Dylan's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Capitol Hill, the kind of building that was solid and unfussy and had probably been built in the 80s. And had never been renovated in a way that tried to disguise this. The elevator in the building worked. She noticed this because she noticed elevators now in a way she hadn't before October. He opened the door and she could hear from somewhere inside the sound of a child explaining something at length and with authority. She's been rehearsing, Dylan said, holding the door open. He looked slightly tired in the good way. The way of someone who had been up since early because a small person in their house had been up since early. Fair warning. I'm ready, Claire said. The apartment was not what she might have expected from someone with the financial profile he'd described in the restaurant, and it was exactly what she should have expected from everything else she knew about him. It was an ordinary apartment, lived in, not staged, with a child's drawings on the refrigerator and a pair of small rain boots by the door and a bookshelf that had been partially reorganized at child height and partially left in adult order above it. There was a legible tension between someone who owned the space and someone who was in the process of taking it over, and the latter was winning. In the living room on the coffee table, arranged on a piece of blue construction paper with a hand-lettered sign that said Norris Kreisel. Display. The spelling unrevised, which Claire appreciated, were 11 crystals of various sizes. Some were copper sulfate blue, some were the pale greenish color of a different compound. One was a large salt crystal that caught the afternoon light from the window and threw small bright points across the ceiling. The child standing next to the display was small, serious-faced, and wearing a sweater with a cat on it. She had Dylan's dark hair and a quality of focused attention that was unmistakably his, though on a 6-year-old face it had a different texture, more immediate, less filtered, the kind of attention that hasn't yet learned to moderate itself for social situations. She looked at Claire for a moment with the direct appraisal of a child who hasn't learned to pretend she isn't looking. "You're the one who makes the colors of the rooms," Nora said. Not a question. "I am," Claire said. Nora considered this. "My dad showed me pictures of the hotel, the one with the big windows. The Harrington. The light is good in it," Nora said with the gravity of someone delivering a considered verdict. "I looked at it a lot." Claire looked at Dylan over the top of Nora's head. He was standing against the wall with the expression of a person who is trying very hard to be a neutral party in a situation where he is not remotely neutral. "Thank you," Claire said to Nora. "That means a lot to me." "My crystals also have good light," Nora said, which was a pivot so clean that Claire felt it in her ribs. "Because I put them by the window. Do you want me to explain the science?" "Very much," Claire said. She sat on the floor next to the coffee table because the coffee table was at floor level and Nora was at floor level, and being at the same level as someone who is going to explain science to you seemed right. Nora explained the science. It was partially accurate and partially a theory that Nora had developed independently of the actual science, and Claire listened to all of it with the full quality of attention she gave to things that mattered, which this did, for reasons she was only beginning to understand the full shape of. The neighbor with the dog arrived at 2:15, and the dog was a medium-sized creature of indeterminate breed who was very interested in the crystals in a way that required supervision, and Nora's teacher arrived at 2:30 and spent a genuine 20 minutes asking Nora questions about the process that were good questions, and the afternoon had the particular quality of a thing that was small and completely real. At 4 o'clock, after the teacher and the neighbor and the dog had gone, Dylan made coffee in the kitchen while Nora carefully rearranged her crystal display for reasons known only to her, and Claire sat at the kitchen table and watched him make coffee the same way he did everything, without fuss, with attention, with the specific competence of someone who had learned to do things properly rather than just adequately. "How do you take it?" he asked, without turning from the machine. "Milk, no sugar." "Noted." He turned. "How are you doing?" She looked at him. The question was simple, and he meant it simply. Checking in, reading the room, the thing he did. "Good," she said, and meant it in the full version rather than the deflecting one. This is good." He set the coffee in front of her and sat across the table. From the living room came the sound of Nora telling someone on a toy telephone about crystals. "She likes you," he said. "She liked that I sat on the floor," Claire said. Same thing, in her taxonomy. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I want you to know that I don't do this. Bring people into this apartment. There haven't been many people since..." He stopped, and she understood the stop. She knew from things he'd mentioned in pieces over the past weeks that his wife had died 4 years ago, when Nora was 2. He didn't talk about it at length, not because it wasn't present, but because it had been 4 years and he'd built something on the other side of it. Not over it, but after it, which was different. "I'm careful," he said, "about what Nora gets attached to. I've had to be." "I understand that," Claire said. "I know you do." He looked at her. "That's part of why I'm saying it. You understand it without me having to explain the whole architecture of why." She thought about that, about the way some things communicated themselves without requiring full articulation, and how rare that was, and how you didn't fully appreciate how rare it was until you encountered the alternative enough times. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She said it quietly. and meant it seriously, without inflation. It was the truest thing she knew how to say right now, so she said it. He looked at her across the kitchen table for a moment, then he nodded, the real nod, not the professional one, and picked up his coffee. And from the living room, Nora announced to no one in particular that the large salt crystal was her personal favorite, and she had decided to name it Gerald. Claire laughed into her coffee mug. Dylan made a sound that was a laugh that had been imperfectly contained. Gerald, Claire said. She names things, he said. The car is Patricia. The vacuum cleaner is Steve. Steve is a very good vacuum cleaner name. He's not a very good vacuum cleaner, Dylan said, but she likes him. She stayed until 6, which was dinner time, and Dylan made the kind of dinner that a person makes when they've been doing it alone for a while. Competent, practical, nothing that required more than 40 minutes, and genuinely good. Nora ate approximately 40% of what was on her plate and declared the rest scientifically unnecessary, which was apparently a recurring dynamic, and Dylan accepted this with the patience of someone who had stopped fighting a battle that couldn't be won and redirected his energy to the things that could. After dinner, Nora showed Claire the drawing she'd done of the Harrington lobby. A child's rendering, the proportions enthusiastic rather than accurate, but the high windows unmistakable and the light coming through them represented in yellow crayon stripes that were, Claire thought, actually not wrong about the quality of it. She drove home at 7:30 with the drawing in her bag because Nora had offered it and Claire had accepted it with the seriousness the offer deserved. She put it on her refrigerator when she got home. She stood back and looked at it for a moment, the big windows, the yellow light, the approximate figures standing in the approximate lobby, and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't need to name to recognize. The months after that had the shape of things that are being built rather than things that arrive complete, which is to say they were not frictionless. They had the ordinary difficulties of two people who are both independent and careful and had both spent time alone and had learned the habits of aloneness that don't dissolve just because you'd like them to. Dylan's travel schedule in the first quarter was heavier than the week-a-month projection. There were 2 weeks in February where he was in Bozeman for 9 days straight, and the Bozeman property review turned out to be more complicated than anyone had projected, which meant that the 9 days extended to 12, and the 12 days were a kind of test that neither of them had planned for. She was fine. She was genuinely fine, which was also what she told Maya when Maya asked if she was fine. But she was aware of the shape his absence left in the week, in a way that was different from how she'd lived before October. And she was not always comfortable with that awareness, with how much real estate another person could quietly occupy without your having invited them to. She told him this one evening on the phone from Bozeman, because she had a general policy against being dishonest with him, and it applied even to things that were uncomfortable to say. "I don't love how much I notice when you're not here," she said. A pause on his end, not a long one. "Is that a bad thing?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. It's unfamiliar." "I notice too," he said, "for what it's worth." "It's worth something," she said. "I'm still deciding how much." "That's fair," he said. And then, after a moment, "Nora asked me to tell you that Gerald is doing well." She laughed. "Tell her I'm relieved. She's also grown 3 new small ones that she's considering naming after planets." "That's scientifically coherent, actually." "I'll tell her you approve. She'll cite you as an authority." The call ended at 10:30, and she went to bed and looked at the ceiling for a while before sleeping, thinking about how authority worked. Real authority, the kind that wasn't about position or title or the size of the number attached to your name. Thinking about a 6-year-old who named her crystals, and a man who carried a toolbox in his suit jacket in a broken elevator on a Friday evening in October that had turned out to be the most disruptive mechanism she'd encountered in 3 years at Meridian Pacific. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in that elevator and talked at a stranger about everything she knew about a person she'd never met, and felt something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite fondness, but was in the general vicinity of both. The feeling of looking at a past version of yourself and recognizing clearly what you didn't know then. She thought about the things she'd said, about executives who came in with decisions already made, about the distance between the people who made the decisions and the people who lived with them, about what real leadership was supposed to look like. She had meant all of it. She still meant all of it. and none of it had been wrong exactly. It was just that the specific application had been so spectacularly misaimed that it had become its own kind of lesson. The lesson was not don't judge people, because judging people was how you navigated a world that required decisions before complete information arrived. The lesson was something more specific and more uncomfortable, that the strength of your certainty about a person says more about your own anxiety than it does about them. That confidence and accuracy were not the same thing. That the people who surprised you most were usually the ones you'd already decided about. She had decided about Dylan Mercer in a broken elevator with incomplete information and significant fear, and she had been wrong in almost every specific way while being right about the things that mattered. She'd been right that she wanted a leader who understood what work actually cost. Right that she wanted someone who wouldn't forget that the people doing the work were people. She'd just looked at the person standing in front of her and not recognized that he was the thing she was describing. She had done that. She had to own it. And owning it didn't mean punishing herself with it. It meant carrying it the way you were supposed to carry things you'd learned, which was lightly enough to move but securely enough to actually use. The January pitch project delivered in late March, 6 weeks later than originally scheduled because the scope had expanded in a way that Claire had flagged early and managed carefully and Sandra had approved. The presentation was to a full divisional audience plus 2 representatives from corporate headquarters. Not Richard Hollis, who was no longer employed by Meridian Pacific in any capacity, but 2 other senior people who had flown in from Chicago for the quarterly review. Claire presented alone. She'd had the option to present with the full design team and had decided against it because she knew the project well enough to carry it and because there was something she wanted to say in the room that was easier to say when you weren't managing a group presentation at the same time. She stood at the front of the room and presented the concept. A new hotel development at the edge of Seattle's east side, a property that was different from anything Meridian Pacific Northwest had done before. A mixed-use concept that integrated residential and hospitality in a way that required a new design language rather than an iteration of an existing one. She talked about the design language for 45 minutes. She answered 12 questions, 3 of which were hard, one of which was the kind of hard that requires you to say, "I don't know, and here's how I'd find out," rather than reaching for an answer you don't have. She said, "I don't know, and here's how I'd find out." It cost her something in the moment and saved her something larger afterward. Sandra said, at the end, that it was strong work and she wanted it moved to full development. One of the Chicago representatives said he wanted the concept summary sent to 2 other regional offices as a potential model for similar mixed-use developments. Claire packed up her boards and walked out of the conference room into the hallway and stood there for a moment in the very specific way she'd stood in hallways before. The way of someone who just said something that cost them something and is now finding out what it cost. It cost her nothing. She texted Dylan from the hallway because he was in Bozeman and hadn't been able to be in the room. She wrote, "Presentation went well. Full development approval. Chicago wants the concept shared with other regions." His response came in 3 minutes. "I know." Sandra texted me. She read that twice. Of course Sandra had texted him. They talked regularly. He was her direct superior. It was a completely normal operational communication. And then, "I told you," he added. She put her phone in her pocket and walked back to her desk with the specific feeling of someone who had been right about something they were afraid about, which was a better feeling than most, though it still had adrenaline in it. Ben looked up when she sat down. He said nothing. He simply gave her a nod, the kind that acknowledged a thing without requiring the thing to be spoken, and went back to his work. She went back to hers. In April, Dylan's schedule stabilized into something more predictable, and the stabilization let the Thursday evenings acquire a different quality, less the compressed intensity of limited time, more the ordinary texture of a recurring fact. He came over. They ate. They talked about work and about Nora's ongoing crystallographic research program, which had expanded to include geodes, and about things that had nothing to do with work or crystals. A documentary she'd watched, a building he'd seen in a magazine, a conversation Nora had reportedly had with her teacher about why the sky was blue that had gone significantly further into physics than the teacher had anticipated. One Thursday in April, he arrived with Nora, who had a half day from school and had been with him since noon. This was the first time, and it had been preceded by a conversation between Claire and Dylan that was careful and honest on both sides. What it meant, what it didn't mean, the fact that Nora was 6 and understood more than 6 implied, and also less than her vocabulary suggested. The fact that this was a step, and steps had weight. Nora arrived wearing a backpack that contained, apparently, a portable version of her geological research program, including Gerald. She set Gerald on Claire's kitchen table, with the gravity of someone placing something important in an important place. "He travels well," Nora informed her. "I'm glad," Claire said. "Would you like to see the design sketches for the new project, the East Side development?" Nora looked at her with a serious appraisal. "Are there big windows?" "Different kind of windows," Claire said. "More on the sides. Let me show you." She spread the concept sketches on the kitchen table. The working versions, the ones with pencil marks and revised dimensions and post-it notes, not the polished presentation version. Nora looked at them with the same focused attention she gave to her crystals. She pointed to the residential tower section. "People live there?" "They will, yes." "And the hotel part is there?" "Connected. You can go from one to the other through here." Claire traced the connector corridor with her finger. Nora studied this. "Why?" "So that people who live there can use the hotel amenities, and hotel guests can feel like they're part of a neighborhood rather than just a hotel." Nora considered this for a long moment. "That's smart," she said. "Thank you." "Gerald thinks so too," Nora added, which was a thing Claire was going to treasure for a long time. Dylan was at the counter making coffee, as he did in her kitchen now, with the ease of someone who had learned where things were and used the knowledge without making it strange. He'd heard the exchange and was doing the thing where he contained a smile imperfectly. She caught his eye over Nora's head. He looked at her in the way he looked at her when he was feeling something he didn't need to say because saying it would reduce it. She looked back at him in the way she looked at him when she understood that. There was a version of this story, she thought, that she could have told differently. That started in a broken elevator with a woman who was wrong about almost everything and positioned that as the central joke. Look how mistaken she was. Look how dramatic the irony. It was a good story in that telling. It had clean lines. But the truth of it was messier and more interesting than the irony. The truth was that she had been afraid, and fear had made her loud and confident about a person she didn't know, and then she'd had to live in the same building as that person for weeks and watch her confident wrongness disassemble itself piece by piece. And it had been uncomfortable and instructive and ultimately more useful than being right would have been. The truth was that she still caught herself sometimes, still felt the pull toward the comfortable certainty of a quick read on a new situation, a fast classification, a story that made sense immediately. It was a human impulse and probably a useful one in most contexts, but she was better at noticing it now, better at sitting in the uncertainty a few seconds longer before deciding she knew. Dylan brought 2 coffees to the table and a glass of milk for Nora, who was now asking Gerald his opinion on the connector corridor in a low, private voice that suggested she wasn't performing this for an audience but was genuinely consulting him. Claire picked up her coffee. "How's Bozeman looking for Q3?" she asked. "The operational review is complete. The property's in better shape than the initial assessment suggested." He sat down. "I might be able to cut the travel there down to once a quarter rather than monthly. That would help." "That would help it," he agreed, in the tone of someone who meant it for all the same reasons she did. Nora looked up from the sketches. "Can I keep this one?" She was pointing to a small thumbnail sketch of the connector corridor. Not a final version, just a working sketch, the kind that had revision marks and a coffee stain on the corner. Claire looked at it. "That one's a working sketch. It's not finished." "I like the not finished ones better," Nora said. Claire thought about that. About the working versions of things. The ones with pencil marks and revisions and post-it notes. The ones that showed how you got somewhere rather than just where you ended up. About the first version of the Harrington palette and the Portland lighting fixtures and the 17 revisions and the mezzanine workspace that made the space better than the original brief. About a relay board temporary fix and a legal pad with handwritten notes and an email chain that had been sitting in an archive folder for 16 months until someone looked at the right place at the right time. About the elevator, which had started none of this and started all of it. Okay, she said. You can have the not finished one. Nora accepted this with a nod and placed the sketch carefully in her backpack next to Gerald. They finished their coffee, and the afternoon settled into the particular ease of an ordinary Thursday. The conversation moved through a few things, and then nowhere specific. Nora fell asleep on the couch with her backpack still on because she fought sleep the way some children did, as though something important might happen without her. And Dylan carried her to the spare room Claire had stopped calling the spare room in her own head, covering her with the blanket that had appeared in the apartment sometime in March, and acquired a permanent position without either of them making a formal decision about it. He came back to the kitchen and sat down, and they talked quietly the way you talk when there's a child sleeping nearby, which was the same as talking normally, but with more awareness of the silence between the words. At 9, he said he should get her home. He went to get Nora, who was briefly resistant in the heavy, not quite awake way of children pulled from sleep before they're ready, and then was contained and reassembled and extracted from the apartment with her backpack and Gerald and the working sketch, and the general equipment of being 6 years old in a world that required a lot of gear. At the door, with Nora already in the hallway conducting a quiet, one-sided conversation with someone only she could see, Dylan turned back. "Thank you," he said. "For what specifically?" "For the sketch," he said. "For the connector corridor explanation. He looked at her. "For this being something she can be part of, rather than something that has to be managed around her." She understood what that cost him to say. 4 years of being careful. Of protecting something small and serious-faced that named her crystals and slept with her backpack on and was the most important thing in his life by a distance that was not close. "She's easy to include," Claire said. And then, because it was true, "She's great, Dylan." He looked at her for a moment in the doorway, with Nora in the hallway behind him, and the apartment warm at Claire's back, and the April night outside with its particular quality of almost spring that Seattle managed without fully committing. "Yeah," he said. "She is." He left. She closed the door and stood in her kitchen and looked at the coffee cups on the table and Nora's glass of milk and the concept sketches still spread across the surface, and Gerald's absence, which was the wrong word for it. Gerald's relocation to a backpack in the elevator, headed home. She looked at the Harrington drawing on the refrigerator, the big windows, the yellow crayon light, the approximate figures in the approximate lobby, which was not accurate but was true in the way that children's drawings were true, capturing the feeling of a thing rather than the measurement of it. She thought about the elevator, the October version, dark and stalled between floors, with rain on the building and a stranger in the corner and 30% battery and everything she didn't know about what was going to happen next. She thought about what it would have cost her to know, to have the full story up front, the complete information, the whole picture from the beginning. She'd have been less afraid. She'd have been more careful. She'd have said different things, better things, more appropriate things. She would have missed the conversation that turned out to matter most. There was something in that worth carrying, not a lesson packaged for comfortable delivery, not a principle that resolved cleanly into a sentence you could put on something, just the raw fact of it, that the most important information sometimes arrived in the wrong order, and what you did in the gap, before you knew, before the picture completed itself, that was the part that actually defined you. She had been afraid and honest about it. She had been wrong and found out clearly. She had paid attention and changed her mind on the basis of evidence rather than pride. She had found a document in a folder and submitted it because it was true, not because it was safe. She was still, in various ways, the same person who had stood in a broken elevator and talked too much. That person hadn't been replaced by a better version. She had just been given more information and done something with it. She turned off the kitchen light and took her coffee to the couch and sat in the not quite dark of a Thursday evening in April. With the city outside and the refrigerator drawing visible from where she sat, the yellow lines of light coming through the big windows, the approximate world inside it. She thought, this is what you couldn't have planned. This specific configuration of things, a broken relay board and an honest conversation and a document in a folder and a child named Nora who thought the not finished sketches were better than the finished ones. Which was, Claire thought, probably correct. The not finished ones showed you the work. They showed you the thinking and the second guessing and the revision marks and the moment you changed your mind. The finished ones just showed you where you ended up, and where you ended up mattered. Of course it did, but it didn't tell you anything about who you were. The working sketches did. The errors did. The willingness to start and be wrong and continue anyway. That did. She put her empty cup on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment, listening to the city outside. Seattle in April, beginning to remember that something other than winter was possible. She thought about the relay board, temporary fix holding, elevator running smooth. She thought about the word later, which had arrived on time. She closed her eyes. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do, loud and specific and lit against the dark. And she let herself be in it without needing to know, for once, exactly what came next.